My name is Elias Vance. It feels somewhat strange to commit that to writing, even in a private log such as this, given the circumstances that now govern my days, and more pressingly, my nights. Professionally, my specialization lies in complex data pattern recognition. It's a rather niche field, involving the sifting of vast, seemingly unrelated datasets to find subtle correlations, predictive indicators, or anomalous outliers that might escape conventional analysis. A skill, I was surprised to learn, that was in high demand for this unique posting. The offer itself was, to put it mildly, too substantial to ignore. It arrived through channels I can only describe as discreet, following a period of professional uncertainty after the downsizing. At my previous engagement at the university's astrophysics department, there my work involved charting cosmic background radiation, looking for patterns that might hint at the universe's earliest moments. Here, I wasn't entirely sure what patterns I'd be looking for, but the remuneration suggested they were of significant importance. The need for a fresh start, coupled with a financial situation that was rapidly becoming untenable, made the decision, if not easy, then necessary. I signed the non-disclosure agreements, packed a single suitcase as instructed, and prepared myself for a new chapter, cloaked in government secrecy, and, as I would soon discover, a pervasive sense of the peculiar. The journey to the facility was an exercise in orchestrated anonymity. It began with a nondescript black, collecting me from a pre-arranged, equally nondescript location in a quiet suburb of Las Vegas. The windows were tinted to an almost opaque black, affording me only fleeting glimpses of the neon-drenched city receding in the distance before we hit the open highway. After an hour, the sedan pulled into a featureless hangar at a private airfield. There were no logos, no identifying markers, just the hum of unseen machinery and the arid Nevada wind whipping dust across the tarmac. I was transferred to a small, windowless passenger jet. My two escorts, men in dark, unadorned suits who had introduced themselves only as Mr. Jones and Mr. Smith, a cliché that did little to inspire confidence, were polite but utterly uncommunicative. The flight itself was short, perhaps 45 minutes, though without windows, my sense of time and direction quickly became distorted. Upon landing, on what felt like an equally remote and unmarked airstrip, I was guided into another black vehicle, this one a robust SUV. This time even the drivers, comprised or separated by a darkened partition. The drive that followed was long and increasingly desolate. Through the windshield, I could see the landscape transformed from scrubland to true barren desert. Jagged sun-baked mountains rose in the distance, their peaks shimmering under the oppressive midday heat. We passed through no towns, saw no other vehicles. The only signs of human passage were the increasingly frequent security checkpoints. The first was a simple gate with a board, "Looking guard." The next involved a more thorough vehicle search and a check of my pre-supplied credentials. The third, set deep within a canyon, was a formidable affair with armed personnel, concrete barriers, and what looked like automated weapon emplacements. Each checkpoint served as a stark reminder that I was entering a place deliberately cut off from the world, a place that valued its isolation above all else. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the facility itself came into view. It was not what I had expected. There were no gleaming towers or futuristic architecture. Instead, nestled at the base of a stark, flat-top mesa, was a sprawling complex of low, windowless buildings. They were constructed from a dull, gray material that seemed to absorb the harsh desert light, giving the entire place a strangely muted, almost two-dimensional appearance. The perimeter was marked by an unnervingly high tech fence, topped with coils of razor wire and what looked like sophisticated sensor arrays. There was an air of profound stillness about the place. The only sound the distant, almost subliminal hum of what I assumed was a massive power generator or ventilation system. The heat was a physical presence, pressing down, and the air carried a faint, sterile, metallic tang. My initial processing was as impersonal as the journey. I was led through a series of stark, white corridors by a new escort, a woman with a severe haircut and an equally severe expression, who introduced herself as Ms. Albright, head of personnel integration. My single suitcase was taken, its contents presumably to be scrutinized. I was photographed, fingerprinted, and subjected to a retinal scan. The silence of the place was unnerving, broken only by the click of M's. Albright's heels on the polished concrete floor, and the quiet hiss of automated doors. The few other personnel I glimpsed in the corridors moved with a quiet efficiency, their faces carefully neutral, their eyes rarely meeting mine. There was a pervasive sense of watchfulness, as if the walls themselves were observing. The final stage of my induction was the orientation briefing, held in a small, windowless room furnished only with a table and 2 chairs. Ms. Albright sat opposite me, a thin file folder open before her. Her voice was a monotone, devoid of inflection, as she outlined the general terms of my employment, most of which I already knew. Then, she slid a laminated card across the table. "These are the initial operational protocols, Mr. Vance," she stated, her gaze unwavering. "Commit them to memory. Adherence is not optional. It is mandatory. The consequences for non-compliance are significant." I picked up the card. The heading read, "Facility Orientation Rules, Initial Set." Rule number, Directive 1, all personal electronic devices must be surrendered upon entry. No exceptions. Facility-issued devices only. 3 Corridor 7, Gamma is to be avoided between the hours of 0200 and 0400. No reason will be provided. 5. If you observe Feckering in the Sector B overhead lights, do not make eye contact with your reflection in any polished surface for at least 10 minutes. 8. All food and drink must be consumed in designated mess halls. Never leave organic matter unattended in workspaces. ROC2. Until I read them again. Rule 1 seems standard for a high-security environment. Rule 8, while a little specific about organic matter, could be construed as a hygiene protocol. But Rules 3 and 5, they sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the facility's efficient air conditioning. Avoid a corridor during specific hours, with no reason given. Avoid eye contact with reflections if the lights flickered. This was beyond any standard security or safety procedure I had ever encountered. The bureaucratic matter of fact presentation of these utterly bizarre instructions was perhaps the most unsettling part. It implied that these were not suggestions, not quirks, but established, necessary components of existing here. The very structure of the rules, presented so formally, created a jarring contrast with their irrational content. A contrast that hinted at an underlying reality, far stranger than I had prepared myself for. Are there clarifications available for these? I asked, trying to keep my voice even. Ms. Albright's expression did not change. The protocols are self-explanatory, Mr. Vance. Understanding their necessity is not a prerequisite for compliance. Her tone left no room for further questions. The clear implication was that the system here was absolute, and my role was to fit within it, not to question its foundations. My first few days were a blur of settling into my small, functional living quarters and familiarizing myself with the equally functional, though far more complex, data systems I was assigned to. The work itself was intriguing. In a detached sort of way, analyzing atmospheric particulate data, seismic readings from deep within the Earth, and complex energy signatures of unknown origin. But always at the back of my mind were the rules. The first incident occurred on my third night. I was working late in my assigned lab module, trying to get a handle on a particularly dense dataset. My workstation was located at the end of a long corridor, not far from an intersection. Lost in thought, I pushed back my chair, intending to stretch my legs and perhaps find a water fountain. I glanced at my facility, issued chronometer 01:52. I vaguely recalled corridor 7, Gamma being somewhere to my left. As I stepped out of my lab, I turned left, taking a few absent-minded steps down the intersecting hallway. A figure materialized from the shadows further down, a security guard, moving with an unnerving silence. He was tall and bulky, his features obscured by the dim lighting, but it was his eyes that caught my attention. Even from a distance, they seemed to reflect the minimal light with an unnatural intensity, almost like an animal's. He didn't speak, didn't raise a hand. He simply stood there, blocking my path, a silent, imposing sentinel. A sudden, cold realization washed over me. This was Corridor 7 Gamma, and the time was rapidly approaching 0200. I stopped abruptly. The guard remained motionless. I could feel a prickle of sweat on my forehead. "My apologies," I mumbled, my voice sounding louder than intended in the oppressive silence. Wrong turn. He didn't respond, didn't even nod. I backed away slowly, then turned and walked quickly in the opposite direction, the weight of his unseen gaze pressing into my back. It was a minor thing, easily dismissed as an overzealous guard or my own jumpiness in a new, strange environment. But the intensity of his stillness, the subtle wrongness in his eyes, lingered with me. It was the first concrete sign that the rules were not just words on a laminated card. They were threads in the fabric of this place, and to pull on them, even accidentally, was to invite a response. The seed of doubt, planted during Ms. Albright's briefing, had begun to sprout. This place was not just secret, it was fundamentally, deeply wrong. The weeks that followed my near transgression in corridor setting, Gamma settled into a strange, disquieting rhythm. Life within the facility was a study in controlled monotony. The recycled air always hummed at the same low frequency. The artificial lights maintained a constant, shadowless illumination, and the meals in the designated mess hall, bland, nutritious, and invariably punctual, were consumed in a near universal silence. My colleagues, a collection of brilliant but deeply insular individuals, were not unfriendly, merely distant. Conversations rarely strayed beyond the immediate demands of our work. Personal histories, hobbies, even opinions on the weather sim, which we never experienced directly, were topics left unexplored, as if by unspoken agreement. We were cogs in a machine whose overall design remained opaque, and it seemed everyone preferred it that way, or had at least learned to feign preference. My work continued to be a dive into the esoteric. The data sets grew more complex, the patterns more elusive, and, at times, more disturbing. I was sifting through telemetry from what were described as deep, bore atmospheric sensors, but the readings often resembled biological signatures more than meteorological phenomena. Fluctuations in subterranean magnetic fields that correlated with local wildlife disappearances. Strange, rhythmic pulses of energy emanating from beneath the facility itself, pulses that the official documentation studiously ignored. I flagged these anomalies, submitted my reports through the secure internal network, and received only terse acknowledgments in return. No questions, no requests for elaboration. Just the silent ingestion of data into the facility's vast, unseen maw. The rules, however, never receded into the background. They were a constant, low-level hum of anxiety beneath the surface of daily routine. One afternoon, while working in Sector B, a wing primarily dedicated to materials analysis, judging by the equipment, I occasionally glimpsed through open lab doors. The overhead lights began to flicker. It wasn't a dramatic power failure type of flicker, but a subtle, almost nauseating pulse, like a failing fluorescent tube. Immediately I remembered Rule 5V: if you observe flickering in the Sector B overhead lights, do not make eye contact with your reflection in any polished surface for at least 10 minutes. My workstation monitor, currently displaying a complex waveform analysis, was a sleek black, reflective surface. The polished chrome trim on the desk, the darkened glass of a nearby instrument panel. Suddenly, the lab seemed full of treacherous mirrors. I froze, my gaze fixed on a non-reflective patch of wall. The flickering continued, a sickly yellow, green throb. I could feel my heart rate increase. The urge to glance at my screen, to see if the data stream was affected, was almost overwhelming. But Ms. Albright's voice, flat and devoid of emotion, echoed in my memory. Adherence is not optional. I counted the seconds, then minutes, my eyes darting around the room, carefully avoiding any surface that might betray my own image. Other personnel in the lab, I noticed, were doing the same. A woman across the aisle had her head bowed, staring intently at her lap. A man near the door was examining the scuffs of his shoes with an almost religious focus. No one spoke. No one acknowledged the flickering lights or the collective, silent adherence to the unseen protocol. The air was thick with a shared, unspoken tension. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to the prescribed 10 minutes, the flickering stopped. The lights returned to their steady, sterile glow. Slowly, cautiously, people resumed their work. The incident was never mentioned. It was as if it hadn't happened. But the image of my colleagues, all studiously avoiding their own reflections, was seared into my mind. What were we afraid of seeing? Rule 8, regarding organic matter, also had its unsettling manifestations. Never leave organic matter unattended in workspaces. It sounded like a simple hygiene rule, but its enforcement was anything but. I once saw a senior researcher, a Dr. Eris Thorne, a man known for his meticulous, almost obsessive attention to detail, accidentally leave half an apple on his workbench when called away for an urgent consultation. He was gone for no more than 5 minutes. When he returned, the apple was gone. Not eaten, not thrown away. Simply gone. Thorne's face, normally a mask of academic composure, went pale. He didn't search for it. He didn't ask if anyone had seen it. He just stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space on his bench, then meticulously wiped the area with a disinfectant cloth from a wall-mounted dispenser, his movements stiff and precise. Later that day, I saw him being escorted by 2 security personnel towards Ms. Albright's office. He looked shaken. I never saw Dr. Thorne in the mess hall or the labs again. His workstation was cleared out by the next morning, his projects silently reassigned. The swiftness and silence of his disappearance were more chilling than any overt punishment could have been. New rules would occasionally appear, deliver via the internal messaging system, always brief, always without explanation. One morning, a new directive was added to our individual access cards. Rule 11T. If you hear humming or whispered vocalizations from ventilation shafts, do not acknowledge them. Increase ambient noise levels in your immediate vicinity if possible, e.g., activate non-essential equipment. The casual mention of whispered vocalizations was profoundly disturbing. Were they auditory hallucinations? A known side effect of something in the recycled air? Or something else? The ambiguity was a form of psychological torture. The isolation began to wear on me. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the shift changes and the sterile routine. The lack of genuine human connection. For constant vigilance required to navigate the rules. The unsettling nature of my work, it all conspired to create a pervasive sense of unease. I started to notice things, or perhaps imagine them. The way shadows seemed to linger a moment, too long in the corners of my vision. A faint, almost inaudible skittering sound from within the walls of my quarters at night. The feeling of being watched, even when I was alone. Was it paranoia, brought by the oppressive atmosphere? Or was the facility itself starting to seep into my consciousness? One evening, I was reviewing a particularly troubling data set. It involved a series of deep space translations that the facility had apparently been monitoring for years. The patterns were complex, almost mathematical, but interspersed within them were sequences that felt organic, like a language, but one so alien, so utterly outside human comprehension, that it induced a profound sense of vertigo just to contemplate it. As I leaned closer to the screen, trying to isolate a recurring motif, my facility issued chronometer beeped softly 01:58. I was working late again. Suddenly, a low, resonant hum vibrated through the floor, through the desk, into my very bones. It wasn't the usual thrum of the facility's machinery. This was deeper, more powerful, and it carried a strange, discordant undertone. The lights in my lab flickered violently, then dimmed to a sickly orange glow. My monitor went blank, then flashed with a cascade of cryptic symbols I didn't recognize from any known language or coding system. And then I heard it. From the main ventilation shaft above my workstation, a sound that was not mechanical. It was a soft, wet, dragging noise, accompanied by a series of faint, almost plaintive whispers. The words were indistinct, a sibilant chorus, just beyond the threshold of understanding, but the intent behind them felt palpable. A cold, curious pressure against my mind. Rule 11 slammed into my thoughts. If you hear humming or whispered vocalizations from ventilation shafts, do not acknowledge them. Increase ambient noise levels. My hands trembled as I reached for the control panel of a nearby spectral analyzer, a piece of equipment I rarely used but which, when active, emitted a significant amount of white noise. I fumbled with the switch, my fingers slick with sweat. The dragging sound grew louder, closer. The whispers seemed to coalesce, to focus. I could feel a cold draft emanating from the vent, carrying with it a faint, charnel odor, like damp earth and something else, something metallic and sweet. With a click, the analyzer whirred to life, its fans kicking in, filling the small lab with a rushing broad spectrum hum. The whispers faltered, seemed to recede, drowned out by the mundane noise of the machine. The dragging sound faded. The lights flickered again, then returned to their normal, steady intensity. My monitor rebooted, displaying the standard login screen. The deep, resonant hum from beneath the floor subsided. I sat there for a long time, shaking, the roar of the analyzer a comforting blanket. I didn't turn it off until the first hint of the scheduled day cycle, when the corridor lights brightened marginally. The incident was another stark reminder. The rules were not arbitrary. They were a shield, a set of desperate instructions for surviving in a place where the laws of nature, as I understood them, seemed to be selectively enforced, and where something ancient, something alien, whispered from the vents and pulsed beneath the sterile floors. The facility wasn't just researching the unknown. It was built on top of it, or perhaps within it. And we, the inhabitants, were living on the very precipice of its awareness. The incident with the whispers in the vent left an indelible mark. Sleep became a shallow, restless affair, punctuated by the imagined sound of dragging from within the walls of my quarters. My focus during work hours, once sharp and analytical, was now frayed, prone to distraction. I found myself jumping at unexpected noises, scrutinizing shadows, and reading the laminated rules card with an almost obsessive frequency, as if new, more terrible directives might spontaneously materialize on its surface. The facility, which had initially felt merely strange and secretive, now felt actively hostile, a place of lurking, unseen malevolence. My attempts to find patterns in the rules themselves, to apply my analytical skills to the very framework of my confinement, yielded little. There was no discernible logic, no common thread that could explain their bizarre nature. Some seemed to relate to specific times or locations, others to sensory input, and a few, like the infamous Rule 8 about organic matter, to almost ritualistic behaviors. It was as if they were designed not by a rational mind, but by a committee of madmen, each contributing their own particular brand of paranoia. Or perhaps, and this thought was far more chilling, they were reactions to phenomena so alien that human logic simply couldn't encompass them. One day, a new rule appeared on our internal terminals, stark and unambiguous. Rule 14A. Under no circumstances are personnel to attempt access to files or archives designated level Omega redaction. Attempts to bypass security protocols will be met with immediate and permanent reassignment. Permanent reassignment. The euphemism was chillingly familiar, a direct echo of what had happened to Dr. Thorne. This new rule, unlike some of the more esoteric ones, felt targeted, a direct warning against curiosity. And, of course, it had the immediate effect of making me intensely curious about what a level Omega redaction file might contain. My work involved sifting through vast amounts of data. The system architecture was something I was becoming increasingly familiar with. The temptation to probe, to just look, was a dangerous itch. It was during a routine data sweep, analyzing cross-correlations between deep-level seismic activity and unusual atmospheric energy fluctuations, that I stumbled upon it. A data packet, flagged with a string of security protocols I'd never encountered before, and nested deep within a server directory that was by all rights supposed to be empty. Its designation, Omega Report 734. My blood ran cold. This had to be it. Rule 14 flashed in my mind, a neon warning sign. But the file was there, tantalizingly close, a digital ghost in the machine. My training, my very nature as an analyst, screamed at me to investigate. The potential consequences, however, were equally loud. I hesitated for a long moment, my cursor hovering over the file name. The logical part of my brain urged caution, retreat. But another part, a reckless, desperate part, fueled by months of suppressed questions and mounting dread, urged me forward. With a deep breath, I initiated a low-level access query, not attempting to open the file directly, but to retrieve its metadata, creation date, file size, last access. Benign, standard diagnostic commands. The system responded, but not in the way I expected. Instead of the requested information, my screen filled with a burst of visual static, a chaotic, pixelated snowstorm. Simultaneously, a harsh, grating noise erupted from my workstation speakers, not clean white noise of the spectral analyzer, but a raw, tearing sound, like fabric being ripped apart, or 1,000 voices screaming in unison. filtered through a broken microphone. The sound was agonizing, physically painful. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it seemed to resonate directly within my skull. The static on the screen pulsed in time with the noise, and for a horrifying instant, I thought I saw shapes within the chaos, distorted, elongated faces, mouths agape in silent screams, eyes like burning coals. The air in my lab grew frigid, and the metallic tang I sometimes noticed in the facility's atmosphere intensified, becoming acrid and coppery, like old blood. Panic seized me. I slammed the emergency power off button on my console. The screen went black. The terrible noise cut off abruptly, plunging the lab into an unnerving silence, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the frantic thumping of my heart. I sat there, trembling, for several minutes, expecting security to burst through the door at any moment. But nothing happened. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Slowly, cautiously, I rebooted my system. It came back online normally. No trace of the static, no error messages. The Omega Rapa Art 734 Final Ratatet file was gone. Not just inaccessible, but completely erased from the directory, as if it had never existed. It was a clean, surgical removal, far beyond any standard file deletion protocol. The experience left me deeply shaken. It wasn't just the fear of discovery and permanent reassignment. It was the nature of the system's response. The static, the noise, the fleeting, horrifying images. It wasn't a standard security measure. It was a defense mechanism, raw and visceral, as if I had poked something ancient and terrible, and it had snarled back at me. What kind of information required such a violent, almost sentient form of protection? The incident also brought a new, more personal fear. Had they noticed? Was my transgression logged somewhere, waiting to be acted upon? Ms. Albright's impassive face floated in my memory. The thought of being escorted away, like Dr. Thorne, into the facility's unknown depths was a constant, gnawing anxiety. A few days later, another rule was disseminated, this one delivered on a physical, blood-red card slipped under our living quarter doors during the night. Cycle. Rule 17T. If you encounter personnel exhibiting extreme pallor, dilated pupils, and a repetitive, soft-clicking vocalization, do not engage. Retreat to the nearest designated safe zone and report via emergency channel. Do not, under any circumstances, allow them to touch you. The specificity of it was terrifying. Extreme pallor, dilated pupils, a repetitive, soft-clicking vocalization. This wasn't a hypothetical scenario. This was a description of something they had encountered, something they expected us to encounter. The term safe zone was also new, implying that some areas of the facility were, by definition, unsafe. The red card itself felt like an omen, a stark departure from the usual sterile, digital dissemination of rules. It felt urgent, almost desperate. I began to see the other personnel differently. The quiet, insular scientists and technicians I worked alongside were any of them close to exhibiting these symptoms. Was the pressure of this place, the constant exposure to the unknown, slowly changing us? I found myself scrutinizing faces in the mess hall, listening for faint clicking sounds in the quiet corridors. The paranoia was no longer a vague unease. It was a sharp, specific fear, a constant companion. The facility was not just a place of strange rules. It was a crucible, and I was beginning to fear what was being fought within its walls and within its inhabitants. The line between observer and subject was becoming terrifyingly blurred. The red card-bearing Rule 17 became a talisman of dread. I kept it in my pocket, its sharp corners a constant reminder. The description of the afflicted personnel was so vivid, so clinically precise, that it felt less like a warning and more like an inevitable future. My observations of my colleagues intensified, bordering on obsession. Every pale complexion, every slightly too wide stare, every nervous tick sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The mess hall, once a place of bland neutrality, now felt like a gallery of potential horrors. Was the man across the table, the one who hadn't touched his food and whose eyes seemed fixed on some distant point, merely tired? Or was he changing? The safe zones mentioned in Rule 17 began to appear on the facility schematics, accessible via our terminals. They were small, reinforced rooms, often located near major junctions or critical labs, marked with a simple green circle. Their sudden designation implied a growing instability, a tacit admission that containment, whatever it was they were containing, was becoming precarious. The facility's veneer of sterile control was cracking, and something was seeping through. My work, ironically, became my only refuge, the complex datasets a welcome distraction from the mounting fear. I was tasked with analyzing a new series of NG signatures, these ones originating not from deep space or beneath the facility, but seemingly from within the very fabric of the building itself. They were erratic, almost spastic bursts, correlating with localized temperature, drops and strange, short-lived magnetic anomalies. It felt like the building was having seizures. I dutifully logged the data, noting the increasing frequency and intensity. But the reports, as always, vanished into the digital ether without comment. One evening, as I was walking from my lab module to my quarters, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic clicking, like fingernails tapping softly on a hard surface. It was coming from a side corridor, one I rarely used, designated Sector 4, Delta, an area I knew housed some of the older, less used biological research labs. My heart hammered against my ribs. Rule 17. Common sense, every instinct for self-preservation, screamed at me to turn around, to retreat to the nearest safe zone, to report. But a morbid, almost irresistible compulsion drew me forward. I had to see. I had to know if the horrors described on that red card were real. Moving with a caution I hadn't known I possessed, I edged towards the intersection. Peeking around the corner, my breath caught in my throat. Standing in the middle of the dimly lit corridor, facing away from me, was a figure in a standard facility jumpsuit. Even from the back, there was something profoundly wrong. The posture was stiff, unnatural, the head tilted at an odd angle. And the clicking, it was definitely coming from this person. A soft, wet, chitinous sound emanating from their throat. As I watched, frozen in a mixture of terror and fascination, the figure slowly turned. It was Dr. Albright, or rather, what had been Ms. Albright. Her normally severe, controlled features were distorted into a grotesque parody. Her skin was stretched taut over her skull, possessing a waxy, corpse-like pallor. Her eyes, those cold, assessing eyes that had so unnerved me during my orientation, were now massively dilated. The irises almost entirely consumed by the blackness of her pupils, reflecting the dim corridor light with a flat, dead sheen. Her mouth was slightly open, and from it issued the relentless, soft clicking, a sound that seemed to burrow directly into my brain. She hadn't seen me. Her gaze was unfocused, directed towards the far end of the corridor. Her hands, held stiffly at her sides, twitched, her fingers clenching and unclenching in a spidery rhythm. There was an aura of profound wrongness about her, a sense that the human being I knew had been hollowed out and replaced by something utterly alien. Rule 17th: do not engage. Retreat. Do not, under any circumstances, allow them to touch you. The words were a lifeline. I began to back away, slowly, silently, my eyes still fixed on the horrifying tableau. But then, as if sensing my presence, her head snapped towards me. The movement was too fast, too jerky to be human. Those vast, black eyes locked onto mine. There was no recognition in them, no flicker of the stern administrator I knew. There was only a cold, predatory emptiness. The clicking intensified, grew louder, more urgent, and then she moved. Not walking, but lurching, her limbs moving with a disjointed, puppet-like gait, yet with an unnerving speed. She was coming towards me. Panic, stark and absolute, finally broke through my horrified paralysis. I turned and fled, my boots pounding on the concrete floor, the sound echoing in the sterile corridors. I didn't dare look back. The clicking sound pursued me, seeming to grow closer with every step. I could hear her ragged, gasping breaths, punctuated by those awful, wet clicks. I fumbled for my access card, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold it. The nearest safe zone was 2 corridors away. It felt like an eternity. The hiss of an opening door behind me told me she was gaining. I risked a glance over my shoulder. She was closer than I thought. Her pale face a distorted mask of hunger. One hand outstretched, her fingers tipped with what looked like sharpened, discolored nails. I reached the safe zone door, slammed my card against the reader. The light flashed green. The heavy door hissed open. I threw myself inside, mashing the emergency lock button on the interior panel. The door slammed shut with a heavy, reassuring thud, just as her pale hand slapped against the reinforced viewport. I collapsed against the far wall, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. Through the small, thick window, I could see her. Her face was pressed against the glass, her features contorted, those black eyes staring in. The clicking was a frantic, desperate rhythm against the viewport. She clawed at the door, her sharpened nails screeching against the metal, leaving faint white scratches. Then, as abruptly as it began, she stopped. Her head tilted, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. After a moment, she turned and lurched back down the corridor, the clicking sound slowly fading into the distance. I stayed in that safe zone for what felt like hours, until the day cycle began and the corridor lights brightened. I reported the incident via the emergency channel, my voice hoarse and trembling. The response was a terse, automated acknowledgement. No one came. No questions were asked. It was as if encountering a clicking, transformed. Ms. Albright was just another operational hazard in this godforsaken place. The encounter shattered the last vestiges of my denial. The rules weren't just guidelines. They were desperate measures against a tide of encroaching horror. The facility wasn't just studying the unknown. It was actively, and perhaps losing, a battle against it. And the personnel, myself included, were not just employees. We were bait, or worse, potential incubators. The cracks in reality were widening, and I could feel myself slipping. The data I analyzed, the strange energy signatures, the whispers from the vents, the redacted reports, the clicking horrors in the connected, a tapestry of madness woven into the very foundations of this place. I didn't know what the ultimate purpose of this facility was, or what lay at its heart. But I knew one thing with chilling certainty. I had to get out. The alternative was to become another rule, another red card warning, for the next unfortunate soul to be fed into the maw of the Nevada desert. I fear these may be my final coherent entries. The clicking has started to sound familiar. My name is Elias Vance. It is a name that has been signed on countless incident reports, etched onto brass, plaques at ranger stations from the misty peaks of the Appalachians to the sun, scorched canyons of the Southwest, and spoken with quiet respect, I hope, by those I've had the privilege to serve alongside. For a decade, I have worn the uniform of the National Park Service, a calling that has demanded proficiency in wilderness survival, the grim arts of search and rescue, and the meticulous stewardship of our nation's natural resources. It is a life of quiet dedication, a commitment to the preservation of those few wild spaces left untamed by the relentless march of concrete and commerce. This dedication, this yearning for the profound silence and untamed heart of the wilderness, has now led me to the ultimate crucible, Denali National Park and Preserve in Alaska. I sought this assignment, sought the isolation and the challenge. There's a certain allure to Alaska, what many call the last frontier. Perhaps it's a desire to test the very limits of one's capabilities, or maybe it's a quieter, more personal quest for something lost or yet undiscovered within oneself. I had envisioned Denali as a place of stark, almost spiritual light and beauty, a landscape that could cleanse and clarify. I was selected for a specialized posting, a remote monitoring station deep within the park's interior, ostensibly for unique ecological data collection. I knew it would be solitary. I did not yet know it came with its own peculiar set of operational guidelines rules that were not in any standard NPS manual. The final leg of my journey to Station 7, nestled in a rarely traversed valley on the north side of the Alaska Range, was by a sputtering bush plane that seemed to defy gravity more through stubbornness than aerodynamics. As we cleared the last craggy peaks, the panorama that unfolded was breathtaking, almost brutal in its scale. The Alaska Range itself was a massive wall of rock, glacial ice and snow, a formidable spine bisecting the world. Below, the emerald halo of the boreal forest stretched as far as the eye could see, a deep, ancient green. The pilot, a man whose face was a roadmap of Alaskan winters, pointed towards a barely discernible scar in the wilderness, the station. "That's her," he grunted over the engine's roar. "Good luck, Ranger. You'll need it." Stepping out of the plane, the air was the first thing that struck me. So cold it felt like a physical presence, yet so pure it was intoxicating. It carried the unique smell of snow, a crisp, clean scent with undercurrents of damp earth and distant pine. The landscape was a masterpiece of raw, elemental power, the vast scenery that makes you feel tiny by comparison. I could see for miles across unmarred expanses of tundra and forest, a vista that initially sang of freedom. But as the drone of the departing plane faded, a silence descended, so profound it was almost a sound in itself, surreal experience of total silence I'd read about. It was then that the awe began to curdle into something else, a nascent unease, the sheer, overwhelming scale of Denali. Its ancient indifference felt less like majestic beauty and more like a slumbering beast, its gaze fixed upon me, the insignificant intruder. This place, I was beginning to understand, was a land of paradox, inviting and terrifying, accessible and remote, welcoming and isolating. The beauty was a mask, a lure. The station itself was a small, sturdy cabin, built to withstand the worst Denali could throw at it. Inside, it was Spartan but functional. There was no welcoming committee, no grizzled veteran to pass the torch. Celis, my supposed superior according to the transfer papers, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, on the rough, hewn wooden desk, lay a single, bound ledger. Its cover was plain, dark leather, worn smooth with age and handling. The title, embossed in faded gold lettering, read, Denali Station 7. Peculiar Regulations and Observations. My training had prepared me for a lot, but not for this. The paper within was thick, yellowed, and filled with typewritten entries, some supplemented by spidery, handwritten notes. These were not the standard park regulations I knew by heart. These were different. Denali Station 7, Peculiar Regulations 1. All reflective surfaces within the station cabin, windows, mirrors, polished metal must be covered from dusk until full daylight. Verify coverage before nightfall. No exceptions, too. The northern lights, aurora borealis, are not to be observed directly for more than 5 consecutive minutes. If whistling sounds akin to high frequency radio interference or faint human whistling accompany the aurora, seek immediate shelter indoors. Do not look out until the sounds have ceased for at least 1 hour. Log any such occurrence. 3. Any wildlife exhibiting behavior contrary to established Denali patterns, e.g., unnatural silence from avian populations, herds moving in perfect, uncharacteristic synchronicity, predators and prey congregating peacefully, must be reported immediately via encrypted channel. Under no circumstances are such fauna to be engaged with or approached. Log entry format, code Umbra. 4. The ancient game trails leading towards the geological formation known locally as the Bone Pass, the coordinates appended are strictly off. Limits for all foot and vehicle patrols. GPS tracking units have historically shown anomalous readings and signal loss in this sector. These trails do not officially register on park maps. 5. Should you encounter man-made structures, cairns, or artifacts not documented on official park, historical surveys, or maps, particularly those appearing to be of pre-park indigenous origin, do not touch or disturb them. Leave a small, respectful offering of dried berries, tobacco, or a similar natural token as per traditional Athabascan custom, and retreat from the area by the most direct route. Document and report from a safe distance. 6. Under no circumstances are the names Gieg or Nahani to be spoken aloud. This prohibition is especially critical after dark, within earshot of running water, or during periods of unusual seismic activity. I read them again, a knot tightening in my stomach. The language was formal, almost bureaucratic. Yet the implications sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the Alaskan air. There were no explanations, no justifications, just stark, unequivocal commands. A final, typewritten note at the bottom of the last page read, "These are not suggestions, Ranger. Adherence is not discretionary. Your survival, and potentially the integrity of this sector, depends upon it. S. Blackwood, Sector Supervisor, retired. Silas Blackwood." So he existed, or had. The word retired felt ominous. These rules felt less like safety protocols and more like wards. A fragile set of instructions to navigate a minefield whose true dangers remained unnamed. It was as if someone, long ago, had encountered something here, something terrifying, and these rules were the desperate, codified remnants of that encounter. A corrupted, incomplete map of how to survive in the shadow of an unknown power. My first few days were a blur of settling in, establishing patrol routes, and trying to reconcile the breathtaking beauty of Denali with the unsettling weight of that ledger. The vastness, which I had craved, began to feel oppressive. The silence, initially a balm, now seemed to press in, amplifying every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind through the dense spruce that crowded the lower slopes. Sometimes, I'd catch a fleeting shadow at the periphery of my vision as I navigated the subalpine scrub, only to turn and find nothing but the wind-stunted willows. Was it an animal? Or was the isolation already beginning to fray the edges of my perception? My training warned against letting the wilderness play tricks on the mind, but Denali felt different, imbued with an ancient, watchful presence. One evening, as the extraordinary Alaskan twilight began to paint the sky in hues of violet and rose, I was returning to the cabin. The light transforming the familiar landscape into something otherworldly. I glanced at the cabin window and saw my own distorted reflection staring back. Rule 1. A jolt, cold and sharp, went through me. I fumbled with the heavy blackout curtain, my heart thudding with an irrational urgency. It was just a reflection, I told myself. Just a rule. Later that night, unable to sleep, I stepped outside. The air was biting, the silence absolute. Then, carried on a breeze that seemed to spring from nowhere, I heard it, a faint, high-pitched sound, almost like distant whistling, or the whine of an old radio searching for a signal. My gaze was drawn upwards, towards the star-dusted sky, half expecting to see the shimmering dance of the aurora. Rule 2. The memory of it hit me with the force of a physical blow. I scrambled back inside, the wooden door thudding shut, the sound unnaturally loud in the vast emptiness. I didn't look out again that night. The whistling whisper on the wind a chilling lullaby. The rules were beginning to feel less ink on paper and more like living things, their unseen teeth grazing my sanity, and the ledger of peculiar regulations and observations had become my unwelcome shadow, its typewritten pronouncements echoing in the vast silences of Station 7. The initial unease had solidified into a persistent, low hum of anxiety, a counterpoint to the raw, indifferent beauty of Denali. Each sunrise, painting the colossal peaks with alpenglow, that ethereal, fiery kiss of light on snow, felt less like a new beginning and more like a temporary reprieve. The nights, even with the blackout curtains religiously drawn, as per Rule 1, were the worst. The wind, a constant presence in the Alaska range, seemed to carry whispers that were not entirely of the elements, sometimes a high, thin, keen that reminded me of the warning in Rule 2 regarding the aurora, even when the skies were clear of its spectral dance. Sleep became a shallow, restless affair, punctuated by dreams that felt too vivid, too steeped in the oppressive atmosphere of the station. I'd dream of endless, snow-filled corridors, of eyes watching from the tree line, of the ledger itself, its pages turning in a non-existent breeze, revealing new, more disturbing rules. The isolation, a companion I had once sought, now felt like a tightening vise, pressing in on my sanity. Was this the psychological hibernation some studies of polar isolation described, an emotional flattening as a coping mechanism? Or was it something else, a slow erosion caused by this place and its secrets? I threw myself into the routine of patrols, the physical exertion a welcome distraction. My designated routes took me through a variety of Denali's ecosystems, the lower taiga forests, where spruce and birch grew dense, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The subalpine scrub, a tangle of willows and dwarf birch, and onto the exposed alpine tundra, where the ground was a carpet of hardy mosses and lichens, and the wind bit with an untamed ferocity. The ground underfoot often had a strange, springy quality, the permafrost lying just beneath the thin active layer. Sometimes, my boot would punch through into muck, overlying something hard and icy. It was during one such patrol, near the edge of a dense spruce forest that bordered a vast, open tundra, that Rule 3 slammed into my consciousness with chilling force. I'd been observing a small herd of caribou, their movements usually fluid and natural. Today they were wrong. They moved with a jerky, unnatural synchronicity, their heads all turning at the exact same instant, their usually placid eyes wide and staring, not at me, but at some fixed point beyond me in the dense woods. Then, a profound silence fell. The usual chatter of ptarmigan, the scolding of squirrels, even the incessant buzz of insects all ceased. It was as if the entire forest held its breath, My skin prickled. This was the unnatural silence from avian populations the ledger warned about. The caribou remained frozen for a long minute. Then, as one, they bolted. Not in a panicked scatter, but in a tight, perfectly formed phalanx, disappearing over a ridge with an eerie, coordinated speed. My hand trembled as I keyed the encrypted channel on my radio. Station 7 to Denali Control. Code Umbra. Repeat, Code Umbra. Sector 4, grid reference. I described the caribou behavior, the unnatural silence. The voice that crackled back was clipped. Professional, but I could detect an underlying tension. Acknowledged, Station 7. Log details. Do not investigate further. Maintain your current patrol parameters, but exercise extreme caution. Log details. I pulled out my field notebook. My fingers clumsy with cold, and a sudden visceral fear. The entry in the official station log later that day was terse, factual. But in the peculiar regulations ledger, under Rule 3, I found a handwritten annotation by S. Blackwood. They see it. They know. Don't let it see you knowing. A fresh wave of cold washed over me. The incident amplified my vigilance. Every shadow seemed deeper, every rustle of leaves more sinister. The sheer scale of the landscape, which once inspired awe, now felt like a hunting ground, and I the prey. I found myself constantly scanning the tree lines, the distant ridges, my senses stretched taut. Big nature. I'd read about in a ranger's blog felt less like an embrace and more like the gaping maw of something ancient and predatory. A few days later, my patrol route took me near the coordinates appended to Rule 4A. The Bone Pass. The rule was explicit. Strictly off limits. The official park maps showed nothing remarkable in this sector, just another fold in the rugged terrain. But the ledger mentioned anomalous GPS, readings and signal loss. Curiosity, that dangerous human trait, gnawed at me. I didn't enter the pass itself, but I climbed a nearby ridge that offered a vantage point. The air here felt different, heavier, charged. My GPS unit, which had been functioning perfectly, flickered and died. The radio emitted a burst of static, then silence. From the ridge, I could see the entrance to the Bone Pass. It wasn't a pass in the conventional sense, more like a jagged wound in the mountainside, a narrow, shadowed defile choked with scree and ancient, twisted pines. The rocks on either side were a stark, bleached white, like weathered bones, which I supposed gave the pass its name. There was a palpable sense of desolation, of a place shunned by light and life. Even from a distance, I felt a primal urge to retreat. I remembered Blackwood's note on another rule. Some places remember, some places wait. I didn't linger. I replaced the GPS batteries later. They were fine. The unit powered up as if nothing had happened. The most unsettling encounter, however, came a week later, deep in a rarely visited section of the northern foothills. I stumbled upon it unexpectedly. A small, circular clearing, and in its center, a cairn of stones. It wasn't a trail marker. It was too deliberate, too ritualistic. The stones were dark, river smoothed, and arranged with an undeniable intentionality. It wasn't on any park survey. This was precisely what Rule 5 described aid man. Made structures, not documented. particularly those appearing to be of pre-park indigenous origin. My heart hammered. The rule was clear: do not touch or disturb them. Leave a small, respectful offering and retreat. I had a small pouch of dried berries in my pack, part of my emergency rations. With trembling hands, I placed a few at the base of the cairn, as per the Athabascan custom mentioned in the rule. As I did, I felt a distinct drop in temperature, a prickling on my skin, as if unseen eyes were watching. The silence here was different from the code umbra silence. This was older, heavier, imbued with a sense of ancient reverence and a potent, slumbering power. I backed away slowly, then turned and retreated by the most direct route. The image of the cairn burned into my mind. I logged the incident, the coordinates, the offering. Blackwood's note for Rule 5 was chillingly simple. They are still tended. They are still sacred. Do not presume. The names, Rule 6. Under no circumstances are the names Gieg or Nahani to be spoken aloud. I'd researched them discreetly in some of the anthropological texts I had. Gieg, Nahani, spirits, or perhaps something more from Athabascan lore. The Nahani were sometimes referred to as woodsmen, spirits of those lost in the forest. Gieg was an infamous bad spirit, one whose very thought could cause sickness. The prohibition against speaking their names, especially after dark or near running water, felt like a desperate ward against summoning something terrible. The Koyukon people, whose ancestral lands these were, held deep beliefs about the spirits of the land, of animals, of the mountains themselves. Denali, the Great One, was not just a mountain, it was a presence, a power. One evening, while reviewing the station's geological surveys, trying to distract myself, a tremor ran through the cabin. It was slight, but unmistakable. Denali is a seismically active area. The lamp on the desk rattled, and in that instant, unbidden, one of the forbidden names flashed through my mind. I didn't speak it, but the mere thought, coupled with the tremor and the encroaching darkness, sent a jolt of pure terror through me. I found myself glancing at the door, half expecting to see it bulge inward. The ledger was becoming more than a set of rules. It was a chronicle of fear, a testament to something ancient and malevolent that resided in the heart of Denali. And I, Elias Vance, was now its keeper, bound by its warnings, haunted by its implications, alone in the vast, watchful wilderness. The weight of that knowledge, of those unseen eyes, was a burden heavier than any mountain, and the solitude of Station 7 was no longer a quiet companion, but a whispering tormentor. Weeks blot into a monotonous cycle of patrols, log entries, and the increasingly oppressive weight of the peculiar regulations. The vast, indifferent wilderness of Denali, once a landscape I sought for its stark beauty, now felt like a meticulously crafted prison, its boundaries defined not by fences, but by fear and the cryptic warnings in Silas Blackwood's ledger. My sleep was a tapestry of fractured images, the unnatural stillness of the Code Umbra, Caribou the distant, Bone, White Maw of the Forbidden Pass, and the knowing, ancient eyes I sometimes felt watching from the dense spruce forests that clawed up the mountainsides. The psychological toll of extreme isolation, the kind I'd read about in studies of polar expeditions, was beginning to manifest in ways my training hadn't fully prepared me for. Was it paranoia? Or was Denali itself an active participant in this slow unraveling? The rules, once just ink on yellowed paper, now felt like sentient entities, their presence palpable in the small cabin. Rule 1, the covering of reflective surfaces, became an obsessive ritual. One evening, distracted by a flickering in the radio receiver, I was late drawing the thick blackout curtain over the main window. For a fleeting second, as the last vestiges of the Alaskan twilight painted the sky in bruised purples and oranges, I caught my reflection. But behind my shoulder, deeper in the glass, something else seemed to shift, a flicker of movement. Too tall, too gaunt to be an animal, too quick to be a trick of the fading light. I slammed the curtain across, my breath catching in my throat. The image seared into my mind. I spent the rest of that night with my back to the wall. Every creak of the cabin, every sigh of the wind amplified 100-fold. Blackwood's scrawled addendum to Rule 1 read, "They see out. Don't let them see in. What looks back is not always you." The aurora borealis, when it appeared, was no longer a celestial wonder, but a harbinger of dread. One particularly active night, the sky writhed with curtains of green and violet light. Then came the whistling, as Rule 2 warned, faint at first, like high-frequency interference, then growing more distinct, almost melodic, but utterly devoid of human warmth. It seemed to emanate not from the sky, but from the air itself, from the very fabric of the silence around the station. I retreated indoors, heart pounding, the sound seeming to probe at the cabin walls. I pressed my ear to the door, a foolish act, and heard, or thought I heard, something brush against the exterior wood, a sound like dry leaves skittering, though there were no deciduous trees close enough to account for it. The log entry for Rule 2 from Blackwood was stark. The lights danced to their tune. The whistling is their call. Don't answer. My patrols became exercises in heightened, almost painful awareness. The vast, unmarred expanses of tundra, covered in a carpet of hardy mosses and lichens that felt springy and strange underfoot, due to the permafrost just inches below, felt less like open space and more like an exposed stage. The silence of the wilderness, sometimes so profound it was a physical presence, would occasionally be broken by the distant thunder of glacier calving or the eerie creak and groan of trees in the wind, sounds that seemed to carry their own unsettling narratives in this isolated place. I found myself meticulously documenting every anomaly, my field notes becoming a mirror of the peculiar regulations. Ledger. Another, Code Umbra, event occurred near a glacial river, its waters milky with rock flour. A lone wolf, usually a creature of wary intelligence, stood stock still on the opposite bank, its gaze fixed on a point high on the mountainside, its body rigid, emitting a low, continuous growl that was more fear than aggression. Then, like the caribou, it vanished, not with the fluid grace of its kind, but with a sudden, jerky movement, as if snatched away. The ledger became my obsession. I pored over Blackwood's entries, his handwriting growing more erratic, more desperate in the later pages. He wrote of previous rangers at Station 7, some of whom had simply walked away, their gear left behind, their entries in the official log ceasing abruptly. One entry, heavily underlined, spoke of the sounds. The land here has a voice, not just wind or water. It remembers, it calls. Some hear it more clearly than others. This resonated deeply with the Athabascan beliefs I'd researched. The idea that the land, the mountains, even the trees and streams possessed spirits. Denali, the Great One, was not just a geographical feature, it was a powerful entity. A sacred place with its own stories and its own guardians. Rule 6. The prohibition against speaking the names Giyeg or Nahani weighed heavily on my mind. Giyeg, the bad spirit, whose very thought could cause sickness. Nahani, the woodsman. Spirits of those lost. The Athabascan people understood the power of names, of words spoken in places of power. One night, a particularly violent tremor shook the cabin. The Denali fault system was a restless giant beneath us. In the disoriented moments that followed, the name Giyeg surfaced in my thoughts, unbidden and sharp. A wave of nausea and inexplicable dread washed over me. The oil lamp flickered violently, casting dancing, monstrous shadows, and for a terrifying instant, I thought I saw a face in the wavering flame, eyes burning with cold malice. The Bone Pass. Rule 4. Its coordinates were burned into my memory. Blackwood's notes on this were more fragmented, almost unhinged. Not a pass. A door. Older than the mountains. They don't use maps. He'd included a crude sketch, not of a trail, but of what looked like a symbol, a spiral turning inward. I found myself drawn to the official park maps, comparing them to the off-limits coordinates, searching for any hint, any geological anomaly that might explain the dread associated with the place. The area was depicted as unremarkable, just another fold in the colossal Alaska Range. Yet the pull of it, the need to understand, grew stronger with each passing day. A dangerous counterpoint to the explicit warning. My radio, my only link to the outside world, became both a comfort and a source of anxiety. Sometimes the encrypted channel would crackle with static, and I'd hear faint, distorted voices, too garbled to understand, not listed on any official NPS frequency. Were they other isolated personnel, atmospheric tricks, or something else? The Park Service. Archives mentioned strange disappearances and unexplained events in Denali's history. Stories that once seemed like remote curiosities, but now felt chillingly relevant. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the tundra, I found a loose floorboard beneath Blackwood's old bunk. Prying it up, I discovered a small, oilskin, wrapped package. Inside was a tarnished silver locket and a single, folded piece of paper. The paper contained a list of dates, and beside each, a single, spidery word: awake, watching, hungry, calling. The last date was only a few years prior, followed by a hastily scrawled, almost illegible sentence. It knows my name now. The pass is open. A cold dread, sharper and more profound than anything I had yet experienced, pierced through me. The rules were not just precautions. They were a failing defense. Blackwood hadn't just retired. He had become another story in the ledger, another whisper in the wind. And the cycle, whatever it was, seemed to be turning again. The wind picked up outside, howling around the eaves of the cabin, like a mournful chorus, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that my time of passive observation was coming to an end. Denali was no longer just watching, it was waiting. The discovery of Silas Blackwood's hidden cache, the tarnished locket, and the chilling, one-word entries culminating in, "It knows my name now." The pass is open, had irrevocably shifted my reality at Station 7. The peculiar regulations were no longer just a set of bizarre operational guidelines. They were a desperate, failing bulwark against something ancient and aware. Blackwood hadn't retired. He'd been consumed. Another victim of Denali's deep, dark heart. The isolation, once a chosen companion, now felt like a hunter's snare, tightening with each passing hour. The wind, a constant voice in the Alaska range, no longer carried mere whispers. It howled with a predatory hunger, echoing Blackwood's final, terrifying pronouncements. The days that followed were lived on a knife's edge. Sleep was a luxury I could scarcely afford, and when it came, it was plagued by visions of the Bone Pass, its bleached, skeletal rocks beckoning, and of Blackwood's scrawled spiral turning endlessly inward. The psychological hibernation I'd read about in polar isolation studies was a distant memory. My senses were raw, exposed, every nerve ending screaming. I found myself obsessively checking the blackout curtains. Roll 20. The slightest sliver of Alaskan twilight sending jolts of adrenaline through me. The memory of that fleeting, gaunt shadow behind my reflection was a constant, unwelcome guest. The radio became my only tenuous link to sanity, though even that was fraying. The encrypted channel usually reserved for terse, code Umbra, reports crackled with increasing frequency, not with official traffic, but with bursts of static, and what sounded like distorted chanting, almost human but fundamentally other. Were these the voices Blackwood had alluded to in his ledger? The land here has a voice. It calls. The park archives mentioned unexplained disappearances, climbers and even rangers vanishing without a trace in Denali's vastness. These were no longer abstract historical accounts. They felt like imminent possibilities. One morning, the air was unnaturally still. The usual sounds of the boreal forest, the chatter of unseen creatures, the rustle of spruce and birch, were absent. It was a silence more profound, more absolute than any code Umbra event I had experienced. It felt like the entire park, from the permafrost-laden tundra with its springy carpet of mosses and lichens to the colossal, ice-sheathed peaks of the Alaska range, was holding its breath. Then, a low, guttural sound rolled through the valley, a sound that vibrated in my bones, not the thunder of glacier calving, but something more akin to a colossal sigh or a growl. My gaze was drawn inexorably toward the coordinates of the Bone Pass. Rule 40 strictly off limits. But Blackwood's wormeds. The pass is open, echoed in my mind with the force of a summons. The ledger, my constant, dreadful companion, lay open on the desk. Blackwood's final, almost illegible entry under Rule 4 read, "The trails don't lead out, they lead in. The old maps lie. The new maps are blind." I knew then that my time at Station 7 was no longer about observation or adherence to rules. It was about confrontation, or perhaps surrender. The pull towards the pass was no longer mere curiosity. It was a compulsion, a dark magnetism. I checked my gear: ice axe, crampons, emergency rations, the encrypted radio I no longer trusted, and, on a grim impulse, Blackwood's tarnished silver locket. I left the peculiar regulations ledger on the desk. Its warnings had failed its previous keeper. They would likely fail me. The journey to the Bone Pass was a descent into a primal landscape. The official park trails, such as they were in this remote sector, vanished. I found myself following ancient game trails, paths worn into the earth by millennia of unseen hooves and paws, leading towards that jagged wound in the mountains. The air grew colder, heavier. My GPS unit, predictably, went dead. The silence was broken only by the crunch of my boots on the scree and the pounding of my own heart. The rocks here were indeed like bone, weathered and ancient, some bearing strange, almost organic looking striations. As I neared the entrance to the defile, the sense of being watched intensified. It wasn't the fleeting peripheral shadows I'd grown accustomed to. This was a focused, malevolent scrutiny. The wind, when it gusted through the narrow opening, carried a faint charnel scent, and something else, a whisper of names. Gieg, Nahani. Rule 6 screamed in my mind, but it was too late. The names were already in the air, in my head. The entrance to the Bone Pass was darker than any natural shadow. It felt less like a geological formation and more like a maw. As I stepped across the threshold, the temperature plummeted. The faint light from the overcast sky seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness within. The walls of the pass rose sheer on either side, composed of that same bone, like rock, but here it seemed to pulse with a faint, internal luminescence, revealing intricate, unsettling patterns that were not entirely natural, almost like a vast, fossilized script. I pushed deeper, the silence absolute, save for a faint, rhythmic dripping from somewhere above and a soft, almost inaudible scraping sound that seemed to come from the rock walls themselves. The air was thick, difficult to breathe, and carried that same faint, charnel undertone, now mixed with the metallic tang of something akin to old blood, and the sharp, sterile scent of deep, ancient ice. Then I saw it. Not a structure, not an artifact, but a change in the very fabric of the pass. The narrow defile opened slightly into a small, circular chamber, and in its center, the rock floor was not rock at all. It was a dark obsidian-like surface, smooth and reflective, despite the oppressive gloom. And on its surface, faintly glowing, was the spiral Blackwood had sketched. It pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. As I stared, mesmerized, a sound emerged from the spiral, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the stone beneath my feet and up into my chest. It was the sound of the earth itself, ancient and powerful. And from the depths of that hum, a voice, or something that mimicked a voice, spoke directly into my mind. It wasn't in English or any human language, but I understood it with a chilling, primal clarity. It spoke of hunger, of waiting, of cycles, and of names. It knew my name, Elias Vance. The locket in my pocket grew cold, so cold it burned against my skin. I pulled it out. It was vibrating in sympathy with the hum from the spiral. The last of Blackwood's scrawled words flashed in my mind. It knows my name now. The pass is open. The darkness in the chamber deepened, and from the edges of my vision, shapes began to coalesce tall. Gaunt figures, their forms indistinct, their eyes burning with the same cold, internal light as the rocks. They were the watchers, the guardians, or perhaps the extensions of the pass itself. They moved with an unnatural silence, their presence an overwhelming wave of ancient cold and alien intellect. I knew, with a certainty that transcended fear, that there was no retreat. The rules had been a fragile shield, now shattered. The wilderness of Denali, in its most secret heart, was not indifferent, it was aware. It was ancient, and it was hungry. The Athabascan legends spoke of Denali as the Great One, a place of immense power, a spiritual nexus. They spoke of spirits of the land, of mountains, of places that demanded respect. I had trespassed, ignored the warnings. And now the pass, the door Blackwood had written of, was indeed open. And it was calling me in. I am a ranger at Denali National Park, and I am walking into the heart of the mountain. Whether I will ever walk out is a story only Denali can tell. My name is Samuel Ayers, and I am, or perhaps was, a folklorist. Not the dusty academic kind, content with poring over ancient texts in climate-controlled libraries. No, I was the type who craved the source, the raw, untamed narrative whispered around campfires, or etched into the very landscape of a place. It was this craving that led me to my cousin, Arthur Penhaligon, and his remote cabin nestled deep within the boreal forests of northern Canada. Arthur was a recluse by nature, a man who found more solace in the company of spruce and shadow than in human interaction. His infrequent letters, penned in a spidery, archaic script, were my only link to him, and they often hinted at local legends and strange occurrences, tantalizing crumbs for a folklorist like myself. When his last letter arrived, it was different. Shorter, more urgent. He was going away for an extended period. He wrote, some unspecified research trip further north, and he needed someone to look after his cabin. He was vague about the duration, even vaguer about the destination. But he offered me the use of the place, rent-free, for as long as I wished to stay. We chance for you to soak up some authentic wilderness, Sam, he'd written, and perhaps encounter some of the local color I've mentioned. The subtext, the unspoken invitation to explore, the very things that fascinated me, was impossible to resist. The formal introduction of my name, Samuel Ayers, might seem a bit stiff here, but in the context of what followed, a degree of formality feels almost like a shield, a desperate clinging to identity before the rudeness and the rules began to strip it away. The journey to Arthur's cabin was an ordeal in itself, a multi-day affair involving a sputtering bush plane, a bone jarring truck ride over barely, their logging roads, and finally, a long hike along a winding, overgrown trail that Arthur had, with characteristic understatement, described as a bit of a ramble. The cabin itself was exactly as I'd pictured a sturdy, if somewhat dilapidated, log structure hunkered down in a small clearing, surrounded by a seemingly endless ocean of trees. It was rustic, to put it mildly. No electricity, save for a few sputtering oil lamps, and a temperamental generator Arthur used sparingly. No running water. Just a hand pump over a stone, lined well a short distance from the back door, and definitely no phone signal. The isolation was profound, the silence broken only by the sigh of the wind through the pines and the distant cry of a loon. It was, in short, perfect for my purposes. Inside, the cabin was Spartan but clean. A rough-hewn table and chairs, a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a small kitchen alcove, and a narrow bedroom. It smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, and something else, something faintly metallic and unsettling, like old blood or rust. It was on the kitchen table, weighted down by a chipped ceramic mug, that I found the list. It was a single sheet of yellowed paper, the instructions typed, concise and utterly bizarre. At the top, in Arthur's familiar hand, was scrawled, "Sam, follow these. AL of them. No exceptions. Trust me on this, Arthur." The list itself was numbered, 10 rules in all. 1. Ensure all doors and windows are securely locked from sunset to sunrise. Check them twice. 2. Sweep the floors before bed. No crumbs, however small, should be left out. Store all food in the metal bins provided. 3. If you hear tapping at the windows or door after dark, and it comes in threes, ignore it. Do not acknowledge it. Never look towards the source of rhythmic tapping after dark. 4. Never enter the woodshed at the back of the cabin after sunset, no matter what you think you hear. 5. Do not whistle, hum, or sing any tune you cannot name or identify the source of. If you hear such a tune, cover your ears. 6. If you hear soft singing from the woods, especially a lullaby, close your eyes and cover your ears until it passes. Do not listen to the words. 7. Never venture beyond the old stone, well at the northern edge of the clearing. 8. If you observe unusual animal behavior, animals acting out of character, or an unnatural stillness, silence from the forest, return to the cabin immediately and lock the door. 9. If you wake to find a window open that you know you locked, close it immediately without looking outside and leave the room for at least an hour. 10. Leave a small offering on the porch, railing each evening before sunset. Dried fruit or berries are acceptable. Never meat. I read the list once, then twice, a slow smile spreading across my face. This was classic Arthur, eccentric, overly cautious, and with a flair for the dramatic. Some of the rules seemed practical enough for remote wilderness living. Rule 81 about locking up was common sense. Rule 2 about crumbs was a bit fastidious but understandable. Rule 8 about unusual animal behavior also seemed like a reasonable, if vague, caution. But the others, ignore the tapping if it comes in threes. Never enter the woodshed after sunset. Do not whistle tunes you cannot name. And the singing. This felt less like practical advice, and more like the superstitions of a man who'd spent too much time alone in the wilderness. Rule 510 about the offering made me chuckle uneasily. An offering to what? The local squirrels? Yet, as the sun began to dip below, the jagged line of the spruce and pine trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the clearing, the list took on a slightly more ominous weight. The encroaching darkness was absolute, a thick, velvety blackness that seemed to press against the small windows of the cabin. I made a point of checking the locks on and windows, as per Rule 51. Twice, I meticulously swept the floor and stored my meager provisions in the designated metal bins. I even found a small handful of dried cranberries in my pack and, feeling a bit foolish, placed them on the porch railing. The act of adhering to even these seemingly benign rules began a subtle shift within me, a quiet acknowledgement of an authority I didn't understand. That first night was a symphony of unfamiliar sounds. The wind, as Arthur's list had predicted, sighed through the dense canopy of the boreal forest, a mournful, drawn-out sound like the breathing of some colossal beast. Branches, heavy with unseen burdens, scraped against the roof and walls with an irregular rhythm. I lay in the narrow bed, every sense on high alert. A floorboard creaked in the main room. The cabin's settling, I told myself. A shadow in the corner of my eye seemed to stretch and recoil, a trick of the flickering lamplight. Fatigue from the long journey, I reasoned, but the feeling of being watched, an almost tangible pressure on my skin, was harder to dismiss. I found myself listening intently, straining to decipher the myriad noises of the northern night, the rules a nagging counterpoint in the back of my mind. The wilderness outside felt vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent to my presence. Yet the cabin, with its strange list of dictates, felt like a very specific, very personal crucible. The initial bemusement I'd felt towards Arthur's list rapidly eroded over the subsequent days, replaced by a gnawing, insidious anxiety. I found myself adhering to each rule with a meticulousness bordering on obsession. The list became the silent, unyielding governor of my waking hours, its strange pronouncements dictating my movements, my thoughts, even my breathing. Each rule followed, each potential infraction avoided, seemed to reinforce its grim necessity, tightening the invisible net of unease around me. The isolation, once a romantic notion, now felt absolute, a suffocating blanket woven from silence and the endless, watching trees. Sleep became a shallow, restless affair, punctuated by the cabin's groans and the forest's nocturnal whispers. I'd wake with a start, heart hammering, convinced I'd heard the rhythmic tapping from Rule 23, or the faint strains of an unidentifiable tune that would have violated Rule 5. I started talking to myself, quiet reassurances that sounded hollow in the oppressive stillness. I even found an old, leather-bound journal of Arthur's, mostly filled with sketches of plants and observations on weather patterns, and began to jot down my own increasingly disjointed thoughts, a desperate attempt to anchor my fraying sanity. The dread associated with certain rules became particularly acute. Sunset, once a beautiful spectacle, now heralded a period of heightened tension, The woodshed's Rule 54F loomed at the back of the cabin, its shadowed doorway a gaping maw. I avoided with a superstitious diligence. Once the light began to fail, I'd find myself straining my ears after dark, trying to differentiate the innocent scrape of a branch from the deliberate, sinister tap, tap, tap that Rule 53 warned against. The simple act of walking through the cabin became a minefield of potential sonic transgressions. I moved with a self-conscious quiet, terrified of accidentally producing a whistle or a hum that might run afoul of Rule 55. This constant vigilance, this obsessive monitoring of my environment and my own behavior was exhausting. My perception sharpened to an almost painful degree. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle in the undergrowth outside, every shift in the wind's cadence became a potential harbinger of something unknown and malevolent. The line between prudent caution, as dictated by the rules, and outright paranoia was becoming dangerously blurred. The northern Canadian environment, initially a stoic, indifferent backdrop, began to feel like an active participant in my growing unease. The dense boreal forest, with its towering spruce and fir, felt less like a collection of trees and more like a silent, collective witness. The feeling of being watched, which had been a subtle undercurrent on the first night, intensified whenever I stepped outside, even in the pale light of day. It was as if the forest itself had countless unseen eyes. The nights grew colder, a biting, dry cold that seeped through the log walls and settled deep in my bones, a physical manifestation of the encroaching dread. The sounds of the wilderness, which Arthur's List had so casually mentioned, transformed. The distant rush of a stream, perhaps like the boisterous mountain stream one might hear in Nahanni National Park, now sounded like a mournful, unending lament. The chirping of unseen birds, which in another context might have been cheerful, here felt shrill, almost mocking. The wind no longer just sighed, it whispered, its passage through the white spruce, carrying sibilant murmurs that seemed to hover just beyond the edge of comprehension. Wildlife, when I encountered it, became a source of fresh anxiety. One afternoon, a massive bull moose, its antlers like a gnarled crown, emerged silently from the tree line and stood regarding the cabin with an unnerving stillness. Was this the unusual animal behavior Rule Fede alluded to? How could I possibly know? Its dark eyes seemed to hold an ancient, unsettling wisdom. Later, I noticed that the normally chattering black chickadees that frequented the clearing would fall utterly silent. Whenever I approached the northern edge, near the old stone well mentioned in Rule 57, one evening, as dusk was settling, I heard it, a distinct tap, tap, tap on the bedroom window. My blood ran cold. I froze, heart pounding, remembering Rule Pawnee 3. Ignore the tapping if it comes in threes. Never look towards the source of rhythmic tapping after dark. The sound came again. Precise, insistent. I fought down the overwhelming urge to wrench back the curtain. Later, when the first rays of dawn finally broke, I examined the window from the outside. There were no branches close enough to have made such a sound. My attempts to rationalize the rules, to find logical explanations, grew increasingly feeble. I inadvertently tested a minor boundary when I found the kitchen window, which I was certain I had locked, slightly ajar one morning. Rule 89 flashed in my mind. If you wake to find a window open that you know you locked, close it immediately without looking outside, and leave the room for at least an hour. Panic seized me. I slammed the window shut, averting my eyes from the world beyond the glass, and practically fled into the main room, where I paced for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with unspecified horrors. Nothing immediate happened, but the anxiety lingered, a toxic residue. The rules were absolute, but reality, or my perception of it, was becoming dangerously fluid. I started having vivid, unsettling dreams that seemed to bleed into my waking hours. Fleeting images of shadowy figures in the woods, the sound of soft, unintelligible singing, the oppressive feeling of being trapped. The true depth of my isolation was hammered home when I tried, in a moment of desperate hope, to use the ancient-looking telephone I'd found tucked away in a dusty corner. It was, of course, completely dead. My cell phone remained a useless brick, displaying no service, with mocking consistency. The small, battery-operated radio I'd found could only pick up crackling static, occasionally interspersed with faint, distorted music that sounded like something from a bygone era, or unsettling sequences of what seemed like numbers being read in a monotone voice. The no communication horror trope was playing out in stark reality. This technological severance from the outside world wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a profound severing from my support systems, from any semblance of normalcy, amplifying my vulnerability to an almost unbearable degree. I was utterly alone with the cabin, the list, and whatever unseen presence enforced its chilling dictates. I briefly considered making a run for it, trying to follow the track back to civilization, but the thought of venturing beyond the old stone well, Rule Pay 7, into that vast, unmarked, and increasingly menacing wilderness was a terrifying prospect. The path I'd driven in on seemed less clear. My memory, almost as if the forest itself was actively trying to obscure it. My perception of time began to warp, days bled into one another, marked only by the relentless cycle of sunset and the anxious adherence to the rules. I started seeing fleeting movements at the periphery of my vision, hearing whispers that could have been the wind, or something far more sinister, a gradual erosion of my grip on reality. Was I going mad? Or were the rules the only fragile barrier standing between me and an unimaginable horror? The internal conflict was a constant torment. The breaking point arrived, as I suppose it inevitably must in such circumstances. It wasn't an act of foolish bravado or careless stupidity, the kind of blunder you scoff at in horror films. It was born of desperation, a frantic, clawing need to understand, to reclaim some sliver of control in a situation that had stripped me bare. For days, the soft singing mentioned in Rule 86 had been a faint, intermittent presence at the edge of my hearing, particularly as dusk settled. It was always distant, a melodic fragment that would vanish if I tried to focus on it. But on this particular evening, it was different. Closer, clearer, and imbued with an almost unbearable sorrow. It sounded like a woman humming a lullaby, a melody both beautiful and profoundly unsettling. Rule Phase 6 was explicit. If you hear soft singing from the woods, especially a lullaby, close your eyes and cover your ears until it passes. Do not listen to the words. But this time, woven into the melody, I thought I heard a word. My name. Samuel. My blood turned to ice. Was it a trick of the wind? A hallucination born of stress and isolation? Or was someone out there? Someone who knew I was here? The thought that it might be a cry for help, someone lost or injured in this vast wilderness, warred with the primal fear the list had instilled in me. What if Arthur had returned and met with some accident? The singing grew more insistent, the melody weaving a strange, hypnotic pattern. Against every instinct that screamed caution, against the explicit command of the rule, I found myself moving towards the window, peering out into the deepening twilight. I didn't open my eyes fully, not at first, just a slit, trying to locate the source. The singing seemed to be coming from the direction of the old stone well, near the edge of the denser woods to the north, the very area rule Fate 7 forbade me to approach. And then, I did it. I opened my eyes. I listened. The consequence not immediate, not a sudden monstrous appearance. Instead, a profound coldness swept through the cabin. A chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature and everything to do with a dawning, soul crushing dread. The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath. And then, a low, guttural sound emanated from the woods near the well, a sound that was not animal, not human, something that vibrated deep in my chest and spoke of ancient, insatiable hunger. It was a sound that hinted at the Wendigo of Algonquin lore, a creature of endless winter and ravenous appetite, or perhaps the Wahila, the great unnatural wolf, bear said to haunt the remote valleys. Whatever it was, the breaking of rule, Phase 6 had alerted it to my focused attention, perhaps even to my vulnerability. This was the true horror sets in. Moment, a shift from passive dread to active menace. Terror, sharp and electrifying, propelled me into a frantic search of the cabin. If Arthur had faced this, he must have left some clue, some explanation beyond the stark list. My previous cursory glances through his belongings became a desperate ransacking. Stuffed at the bottom of an old wooden chest, beneath a pile of moth-eaten wool blankets, I found another journal, smaller and far more worn than the one with sketches. Its pages were filled with Arthur's cramped, agitated script. This was no naturalist's log. This was a record of fear. He hadn't created the rules. He'd found them, just as I had, left by a previous occupant, or perhaps occupants, stretching back into an unrecorded past. His entries detailed his own terrifying encounters, his attempts to understand the presence, as he called it. He wrote of the tapping, the singing, the oppressive feeling of being watched. He theorized about its connection to the land itself, an ancient spirit of the boreal forest, something tied to the cycles of feast and famine, life and brutal death that defined this wilderness. There were crude drawings of symbols, he'd found carved into the floorboards under his bed, or etched onto stones near the well. Symbols I now realized I'd seen myself, but dismissed as random scratches. One passage chilled me to the core. It learns. It adapts. The rules are a truce, a fragile one. Broke rule feint 4 last night. The shed god, the shed. It showed me things. I don't think I can ever unsee them. There was no further entry after that one for several weeks. Then a final, almost illegible scrawl. It knows my name now. The politeness is gone. Arthur had broken a rule, and the consequences had been dire. The journal didn't offer salvation. It offered a confirmation of the abyss. The knowledge was a double-edged sword, validating my terror while simultaneously stripping away any hope of a rational explanation or easy escape. My sanity, already frayed, began to unravel with alarming speed. The cabin itself seemed to conspire against me, its familiar dimensions subtly shifting, shadows deepening into malevolent shapes, the very air thick with an unseen antagonism. I'd experience vivid waking nightmares. The walls of the cabin would seem to breathe. The floorboards would ripple like water, and the small windows would show me glimpses of a distorted, nightmarish version of the forest outside. Periods of lost time became more frequent. I'd find myself staring blankly at a wall, with no memory of how long I'd been there. The remaining rules became both my only perceived lifelines and sources of acute, debilitating paranoia. Was it safer to remain barricaded inside, a prisoner of the list, or to risk breaking another rule in a desperate bid for an escape that seemed increasingly impossible? The face I saw in the small, cracked mirror in the bedroom was a stranger's gaunt, wild-eyed, teetering on the precipice of utter madness. The entity, whatever it was no longer content with subtle hints. It was actively besieging my mind. The final night descended upon the cabin like a physical entity, a suffocating shroud of impenetrable blackness. The wind, which had been a constant companion, died away completely, leaving an unnatural, ringing silence that was somehow more terrifying than its mournful sighs. I knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in my gut, that this was it. The breaking of Rule Phase 6. My focused attention on the singing had irrevocably altered the fragile da-tenti. The entity, the enforcer of Arthur's chilling list, was no longer content to lurk at the periphery. It was coming. This was the fall. The moment where the worst thing happens, where you don't think you can get up. I dragged the heavy wooden table against the main door, wedged the armchairs against the windows, pathetic barricades against something that could seemingly manipulate the very fabric of my reality. But the act of doing something was a small rebellion against the encroaching paralysis of fear. The remaining rules flickered through my mind like failing emergency lights. Rule A1. Ensure all doors and windows are securely locked. Checked, double-checked, triple-checked, though the memory of the mysteriously opened window mocked my efforts. Rule 3. Ignore the tapping if it comes in threes. But what if it wasn't just tapping anymore? The first overt assault was auditory. A low hum started, seeming to emanate from the very walls of the cabin, a resonant frequency that vibrated through my teeth and bones. It grew in intensity, accompanied by a sound like immense wings beating slowly, rhythmically, just outside. Then came the scratching, not the familiar scrape of branches, but a deliberate claw, like scraping that moved around the cabin, testing the windows, the door. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was no longer just psychological. This was a siege. Then the tapping began. Not in threes. It was a frantic, irregular drumming on the main door, on the boarded-up windows, as if dozens of bony knuckles were rapping for entry. Interspersed with this was a sound that chilled me more than any other, a soft, wet, tearing sound, like fabric being slowly ripped, or something worse. I huddled in the center of the room, a rusty fire poker clutched. In my trembling hands, a useless talisman. The sensory assault was overwhelming, designed to shatter what little remained of my sanity. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the cacophony, but the sounds seemed to bypass my ears and drill directly into my skull. A sudden, sharp crack from the direction of the woodshed made me jump. Rule White 4A: never enter it after sunset, no matter what you think you hear. Arthur's journal entry about the shed flashed in my mind. It showed me things. A splintering sound followed, and then a heavy thud, as if something immense had been dislodged, or had forced its way out. The scratching at the main cabin walls intensified, now accompanied by a low, guttural snuffling, like a massive beast sniffing for a way in. I could smell it then, a rank, earthy odor, like freshly turned grave soil, mixed with something akin to spoiled meat. The entity, the enforcer, was revealing itself, not in a full visual horror, but through this terrifying sensory onslaught. A presence that hinted at something ancient and primal, something that might have crawled from the darkest legends of this land. Perhaps it was the Wahila, the great beast of the headless valleys, its form a nightmarish fusion of wolf and bear. Or perhaps it was something closer to the Kemulik, whose face was said to be beyond human comprehension, its very presence a rending of reality. The air in the cabin grew frigid, my breath pluming before me, a hallmark of the Wendigo's chilling aura. In a moment of sheer, animalistic panic, I made a decision. Staying was death, or worse, madness. The only way out was out. Rule Point 7: never venture beyond the old stone well. To hell with Rule Phase 7. I scrambled to the back door, the one leading to the woodshed, hoping it offered a less direct confrontation. My fumbling hands found the latch. As I pulled it open, a wave of the fetid odor washed over me. I didn't look into the shed. I couldn't. I burst out into the night, into the oppressive blackness of the clearing. The world outside was a maelstrom of distorted shadows and terrifying sounds. I ran blindly towards where I thought the old stone well was, the only landmark I could cling to. Behind me, I heard a sound that was not a roar, not a growl, but a deep, resonant sigh, like the sound of the forest itself, but filled with an ancient, predatory hunger. What happened next is a blur of terror and fragmented images. I remember stumbling, falling, the rough ground tearing at my hands. I remember the feeling of icy breath on the back of my neck. I remember a glimpse of something impossibly tall and emaciated, moving with unnatural speed through the trees at the edge of my vision. Its limbs too long, its form shifting and indistinct. I don't know how I survived. Perhaps the entity, having broken my will and shattered my sanity, simply lost interest. Perhaps dawn, which was still hours away, but whose eventual promise might have been a deterrent, played a part. Or perhaps, in some final, desperate act of self-preservation, I simply collapsed and was mistaken for dead. My next clear memory is of lying face down in the damp earth, the first gray light of a desolate dawn filtering through the trees. The cabin was still standing, silent and brooding. The forest was quiet once more, deceptively peaceful. I was found later that day by a pair of bewildered hunters, miles from the cabin, incoherent and suffering from exposure. Arthur was never seen again. The authorities mounted a search, of course, but the northern Canadian wilderness does not give up its secrets easily. I am back in what they call civilization now, but it's a hollow existence. The doctors say it was stress, isolation, a psychotic break. They have pills for that, but they don't have pills for the rules that are now etched into the deepest recesses of my mind. I still check the locks compulsively. I flinch at the sound of tapping. I can't abide whistling. And sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet, I hear it. A faint, soft singing, carried on the wind. A lullaby with no discernible words. And just last week, a letter arrived, no return address. The paper yellowed and brittle. The handwriting spidery and disturbingly familiar. It contained a single, neatly typed line rule. Fay Levantine, some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. My name is Alastair Finch. It is with a measure of trepidation, yet an undeniable compulsion, that I commit these memories to writing. For decades, they have resided in the shadowed recesses of my mind, a collection of chilling narratives gifted to me by my paternal grandmother, Elara Finch. Most were fleeting frights, the kind that make a child wary of the dark for a night or two before fading into the general tapestry of youthful anxieties. But there was one story, one particular account, that burrowed deeper. It became an unwelcome lodger in my psyche, its tendrils entwined with the very roots of my perception. Even now, as a man who prides himself on logic and composure, the recollection of it, and the unsettling echoes it cast upon my life, can send a shiver down my spine that has nothing to do with the ambient temperature. The decision to document this is not born of a desire for notoriety, nor is it an attempt to unburden myself in any conventional therapeutic sense. Rather, it feels like a duty, a final, perhaps futile, attempt to delineate the boundaries between a story and the insidious way it can seep into the cracks of one's reality. The formality with which I approach this task is, I confess, a carefully constructed dam against the flood of unease that threatens to overwhelm me whenever I dwell too long on those formative years spent in grandmother Elara's company. It is a shield, however flimsy, against the creeping notion that some stories are more than just words. Grandmother Elara was not the archetypal purveyor of comforting bedtime tales. There were no benevolent fairies or valiant knights in her repertoire. Her domain was the twilight realm, the spaces between the known and the feared. She was a tall woman, gaunt even in her middle years, with eyes the color of a stormy sea, often holding a glint that was more unsettling than amusing. Her voice, usually a low, measured timbre drop, to a conspirial whisper when she reached the crux of a tale, drawing you in, making you lean closer, despite every instinct screaming for you to recoil. She had a way of looking at you, a penetrating gaze that seemed to suggest she knew the hidden fears you harbored, the ones you barely acknowledged yourself. Her house stood as a testament to her narratives. It was an old Victorian structure, on the outskirts of a town that had long seen better days. Set back from a seldom used road and prepped in the shadows of overgrown, ancient oaks. The paint peeled from its clapboard siding like sunburnt skin, and the porch sagged with a weary sigh. Inside, the air was always cool, tinged with the scent of dust, dried herbs, and something else, something indefinably old and still. Floors creaked with the gravitas of secrets, and the wind, as it snaked through the ill-fitting window frames, seemed to carry whispers from forgotten times. It was the perfect stage for her stories, a place where the mundane felt thin, and the extraordinary, terrifyingly plausible. I often wondered, even as a child, about the source of her tales. Were they products of a morbidly vivid imagination, or did she have some deeper, more unsettling connection to the folklore she so expertly wove? She never said. Her stories were presented as simple truths, accounts of things that had happened, or could happen, if one wasn't careful, if one strayed too far from the light. Her repertoire was extensive, a chilling library of local legends and more personal, familial hauntings. I recall one particularly: bleak winter's evening, the wind howling a mournful dirge outside, when she told me of the fen walker. This was a creature, she said, that haunted the marshlands beyond our town, a gaunt, shadowy figure seen only at dusk, its feet never quite touching the sodden earth. It didn't chase or attack, not directly. It simply appeared, a silent sentinel at the edge of your vision, and those who saw it were said to slowly lose their way, not just in the physical sense, but in their minds, their memories becoming as muddled and treacherous as the bog itself. She described its eyes, or rather the lack of them, just deeper patches of shadow in its indistinct face, and how looking upon it felt like gazing into an abyss that threatened to swallow your thoughts. That night, every shadow in my small attic bedroom seemed to elongate, to take on a vaguely humanoid form, and the familiar patterns of the wallpaper twisted into grotesque, watching faces. Sleep was a distant, unattainable shore. Another time, during a stifling summer afternoon, when the air was thick and heavy with unspoken things, she spoke of the borrowed voice. This wasn't a creature, but a phenomenon. Sometimes, she explained, when you were alone in an old house, truly alone, you might hear a familiar voice call your name, your mother, your father, a sibling. But if you answered, if you called back into the silence, you invited something in. Something that had been listening, learning, waiting to mimic the sounds of safety, to lure you into its grasp. She told of a distant cousin who, as a child, had heard his deceased mother calling him from the cellar. He had answered, and though he was found unharmed, he was never quite the same. He became withdrawn, fearful of familiar sounds, and would often stare at his own family members, as if they were strangers wearing ill-fitting masks. These stories, and others like them, chipped away at my childish sense of security. The world, under Grandmother Elara's tutelage, became a place far more menacing than I had previously understood. Darkness was not merely the absence of light, but a veil behind which unseen things stirred. Silence was not peace, but a listening void. The ordinary, the trusted, could at any moment reveal an unsettling, alien core. My nights were often punctuated by jolts of fear, my imagination painting monsters in the familiar gloom of my room, my ears straining for any sound that was out of place. I learned to dread the fall of dusk when her telling sessions would typically commence, usually in her high-backed armchair by the sputtering fireplace, the flickering light casting her features into a stark, almost predatory relief. Yet, for all the terror these tales induced, there was an undeniable pull, a morbid fascination that kept me returning to her side, hungry for the next chilling installment. It was a strange inheritance she was bestowing upon me, this legacy of fear, one that I both craved and loathed. But among all her narratives, all the specters and strange occurrences she catalogued with such unnerving calm, there was one that was different. She seldom told it. In fact, for many years, I only knew of its existence through oblique references. A certain shadowed tone in her voice, if a conversation veered too close to its periphery. It was her masterpiece of dread, the one story that, even in its unspoken presence, seemed to cast a longer, colder shadow than all the others combined. I sensed it was the heart of her own private darkness, a tale she perhaps wished she could forget, but was compelled to keep alive. I remember asking for it once, emboldened by a rare surge of youthful bravado. Her reaction was uncharacteristic. The usual glint in her eye vanished, replaced by something akin to genuine disquiet. She simply shook her head. Her lips pressed into a thin line and changed the subject with an abruptness that brooked no argument. This, of course, only amplified its mystique, its forbidden allure. It became, in my young mind, the ultimate horror, the secret she guarded most closely. What was it about this particular story that set it apart? What made it so potent, so seemingly dangerous in her estimation? I wouldn't find out for several more years. Not until a night when the very elements seemed to conspire to draw it from her. A night when the world outside her creaking house mirrored the tempest she was about to unleash within my soul. The anticipation of it, even now, is a cold knot in my stomach. For that was the night she finally told me the one story I would never, ever forget. And that is where the true darkness began to take root. The night Grandmother Elara finally relented, the world outside her ancient house seemed to hold its breath. It was late autumn. The kind of evening where the chill seeped not just into your bones, but into your thoughts, making them brittle. There was no dramatic storm, No howling wind to serve as a theatrical overture. Instead, a profound stillness had fallen, a silence so complete it felt like the prelude to something momentous, or perhaps something dreadful. The only sounds were the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound I usually found comforting, but which that night seemed to be counting down to an unknown revelation, and the occasional crackle from the fireplace, where embers glowed like watchful eyes in the dim room. I was older then, perhaps 10 or 11, old enough to feel a more complex blend of fear and fascination, old enough to understand that some stories carried a weight that went beyond simple scares. We were in her usual spot, she in her high back chair, me on the worn rug at her feet. I hadn't asked for the story. I hadn't dared to. Not since her previous, curt refusal. But the atmosphere in the room, thick with unspoken things, and a certain distant, haunted look in her eyes, told me that tonight was different. She had been quiet for a long time, staring into the flames, her gnarled fingers laced together in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower than usual, almost a whisper. Yet it filled the oppressive silence of the room with an unnerving clarity. "There are things in this world, Alistair," she began, her gaze still fixed on the fire, "that are best left undisturbed, unacknowledged. Things that exist in the spaces we try to ignore, in the shadows of our own making." She paused, and I felt a familiar prickle of unease, the precursor to her more potent tales. But this felt different. There was no theatricality in her tone, no glint of dark amusement in her eyes when she finally turned them towards me. There was only a profound wariness, and something else, a flicker of what I can only describe as old, settled fear. "This isn't like the fen walker, or the whispers in an empty house," she continued, her voice raspy. "Those are echoes, remnants. This is about something that takes, something that replaces." My heart began to thud a heavy rhythm against my ribs. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that she was about to unveil the story I had both craved and dreaded. "It happened a long time ago," she said, "in a village not so different from the ones you see now, nestled deep in the folds of the countryside, where the old ways still held sway, and the modern world was just a distant rumor. A place where people knew their neighbors, their histories, their secrets." She described this village, painting a picture of quaint cottages with thatched roofs, a winding cobblestone street, a small, ancient church with a leaning spire, all surrounded by dense, whispering woods and rolling fields that seemed to stretch into an eternity of green and gold. It sounded idyllic, a picture book sort of place. But as she spoke, her words began to subtly taint the image, like a drop of ink spreading in clear water. "They were a close, knit community," she said. "But even in such places, things can go unnoticed. Small changes at first, so small, you doubt your own senses, before you doubt the person before you." Her story centered on a family, a farmer, his wife, and their 2 young children. A good family, respected, ordinary. "The trouble began," she said, "with the farmer, a man named Thomas. He'd gone into the woods one evening To retrieve a stray sheep, a common enough task. He was gone longer than expected, returning well after dusk, looking tired and a little disheveled, but otherwise himself. Or so it seemed. His wife, Mary, Grandmother Alara continued, her voice barely above a breath, was the first to feel it. A subtle off-ness. The way he looked at her. Sometimes. As if he were trying to remember who she was, or perhaps how he was supposed to look at her. He'd forget small things, a promise made, a shared memory. He'd misplace tools he'd used his entire life. Little things. Things easily dismissed. I leaned closer, captivated, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The firelight cast dancing shadows on her face, making her features seem to shift and change, her eyes like dark pools reflecting the flickering flames. "Then," she said, her voice dropping further, the children started to notice. Their father, who had always been quick with a laugh or a story, became quiet. Not a sad quiet, or an angry quiet, just an empty quiet. He would sit by the fire for hours, staring, not really seeing. His movements became a little too deliberate, his smile a little too fixed, never quite reaching his eyes. Grandmother Ellara described how Mary, consumed by a growing, nameless dread, tried to talk to him, to reach him, but her words seemed to slide off him, unheeded. He would respond, yes, but his responses were echoes. Parroted phrases, sentiments that felt learned rather than felt. He was there, but he was not. The villagers began to whisper, she said. They saw Thomas in the fields, working with his usual diligence, but there was a lack of life in his movements. His eyes, they said, were like a doll's eyes, vacant, staring. He still looked like Thomas. He still sounded, mostly, like Thomas. But the Thomas they knew was hollowed out. This was the term she used, and it sent a particular chill through me. The hollowed man. She explained that this thing, this presence, didn't kill. It didn't leave a body. It emptied and occupied. It wore people like a suit of clothes, learning to mimic them, but always imperfectly. The horror wasn't in a sudden, violent attack, but in the slow, creeping realization that the person you knew, the person you loved, was being erased from within, replaced by something that looked like them, but was utterly, terrifyingly alien. Mary lived with this version of her husband for months. Grandmother Alara's voice was strained. Imagine, child, waking up next to it, eating across the table from it, hearing it use your husband's voice to speak, but knowing, deep in your soul, that it wasn't him. The children grew fearful, avoiding him. The dog, once his constant companion, would whine and slink away whenever he approached. The true terror of the story, as my grandmother related, was in this insidious replacement. There was no monster to fight, no clear enemy to confront. Just the slow, agonizing erosion of a loved one, and the dawning horror of what was taking their place. It was a psychological torment, a living nightmare where reality itself became suspect. One day, she said, her eyes locking onto mine, holding me captive, Mary found Thomas, or what looked like Thomas, standing in front of a mirror. He wasn't looking at his reflection. He was studying it, intently. like an actor learning a role. His head was tilted, his expression one of intense concentration, as if he were trying to perfect the minute details of being Thomas. And then he smiled. But the smile was wrong. It was too wide. The eyes remained cold, and, for a fleeting second, she saw something flicker. Behind those eyes, something ancient, and empty, and utterly inhuman. I could almost see it, the quiet room, the man at the mirror, the horrifyingly wrong smile. My own reflection in the darkened window pane seemed to waver. Mary finally broke. Grandmother Alara said. She couldn't bear it any longer. She took the children and fled the village in the dead of night, leaving everything behind. She never looked back. No one knows what became of the thing wearing Thomas's skin. Some say it eventually, tired of the charade, and simply walked away. Back into the woods, perhaps to find another vessel. Others say it still lives in that old farmhouse, a perfect, empty replica of a man who once was waiting. She paused, the silence in the room pressing in on me. The story didn't have a neat ending, no vanquishing of the evil, no restoration of what was lost, just a lingering, awful uncertainty. The hollowed man, she whispered, the name itself seeming to carry a chill. It doesn't want your life, Alistair. It wants your you. It empties you out, bit by bit, memory by memory, feeling by feeling, until all that's left is a shell for it to inhabit. And the worst part is, sometimes, those closest to the hollowed man, they start to forget what the real person was like. The imitation, however flawed, becomes the new reality. The true person is not just replaced, but erased from memory itself. She fell silent then. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room was colder. I sat there, frozen, the story coiling in my stomach like a cold serpent. It wasn't the goriest story she had ever told, nor the one with the most dramatic scares. But it was, by far, the most profoundly disturbing. The idea of being slowly erased, replaced by a hollow imitation of your loved ones not even realizing, or worse, slowly forgetting you. It touched a primal fear I hadn't known I possessed. Unlike her other stories, which often left me with a jumpy, immediate fear of the dark or strange noises, this one settled deeper. It wasn't about what might be lurking outside, but what might be happening inside someone, or even, terrifyingly, inside oneself. The thought was a cold sliver of ice in my mind. Grandmother Alara finally stirred, her gaze softening slightly as she looked at me, though the wariness remained. It's just a story, Alistair, she said, her voice regaining some of its usual timbre. But there was no conviction in her words. We both knew in that moment that it felt like much more than that. That night, sleep was impossible. Every familiar shadow in my room seemed to hold a new, more subtle menace. I looked at my own reflection in the darkened glass of my window, and for a terrifying instant, wondered if my smile was quite right, if my eyes looked back at me with my own thoughts. The tale of the hollowed man had not just been heard, it had been absorbed. It had found a place within me, a dark seed planted in the fertile soil of my young imagination, and I had a dreadful premonition that it was there to stay, to grow, the true inheritance of fear had just begun to reveal its depth. The days immediately following grandmother Alara's telling of the hollowed man were lived under a subtle, pervasive pall. It wasn't the sharp, immediate terror of her other tales, the kind that made me jump at sudden noises or peer nervously into darkened corners. This was different. This was a quiet, gnawing unease that settled in the pit of my stomach and tinted my perception of everything and everyone around me. The world, which had once felt solid and predictable, now seemed to possess a disconcerting fragility, as if its familiar facade could at any moment crack to reveal something unsettling beneath. I found myself observing people with an intensity that was new and disturbing to me. Not just strangers, but my parents, my school teachers, even my friends. I'd watch their expressions, their gestures, the way their eyes met mine, searching for what I didn't quite know. A flicker of vacancy, a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, a moment of hesitation that seemed too long, a response that felt slightly rehearsed. The story had armed me with a terrible new vocabulary of suspicion. Every minor inconsistency, every forgotten name or misplaced object, every slightly off moment that I would have previously dismissed without a second thought, now snagged in my mind. A potential clue, a whisper of the hollowed man. My own reflection became a source of anxiety. I'd catch myself in mirrors, in shop windows, in the dark screen of the television, and a cold dread would wash over me. Was that truly me looking back? Or was it a clever imitation, already beginning its insidious work? I'd force a smile, then scrutinize it. Did it look genuine? Or was it, like the hollowed man's, a little too wide, a little too fixed? I'd try to recall specific memories, testing myself. A desperate attempt to anchor my sense of self, to prove I was still me. The fear of being hollowed out, of my own essence being slowly siphoned away and replaced, became a quiet torment. Grandmother Alara never mentioned the story again. In the days that followed, she reverted to her usual repertoire of less exciting, surely terrifying goals and local legends. But her silence on the hollowed man was, in its own way, more unsettling than if she had discussed it further. It was as if she had unlocked a forbidden door and then simply walked away, leaving me to contend with whatever had slithered out. Sometimes I would catch her looking at me with that strange, knowing expression of hers, and I'd wonder if she saw the story's shadow clinging to me, if she knew the depth of the disquiet she had instilled. Her house, already a place of shadows and secrets, now felt even more charged, as if the very walls were listening, aware of the seed of dread she had planted. I remember one particular incident a few weeks after she told the tale. It was a gray, drizzly afternoon, and I was walking home from school, my head down, lost in the usual churn of hollowed man anxieties. A man was walking towards me on the otherwise empty pavement. He was unremarkable, middle-aged, dressed in a drab raincoat, carrying a worn briefcase. As he drew nearer, he looked up, and his eyes met mine. For a fleeting moment, his expression was utterly blank, his eyes like polished stones, reflecting nothing. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, A smile spread across his face, a wide, amiable, perfectly normal smile. He nodded a polite greeting and walked past. It was nothing. A momentary lapse in expression, perhaps. He was probably lost in thought, his face slackening before he registered my presence. That's what logic told me. But the image of that brief, terrifying blankness, that momentary absence Hood, seared itself into my memory. It was the hollowed man's vacant stare, the look Mary had seen in Thomas before the ill-fitting mask of his personality had been reapplied. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I broke into a run, not stopping, until I reached the relative safety of my own home. The image of the man's empty eyes burning behind my eyelids. Was he one of them? Or was my imagination, supercharged by my grandmother's tale, simply painting monsters onto ordinary people? I had no way of knowing, and that uncertainty was a torment in itself. This became the pattern of my young life. The acute fear gradually subsided, but it left behind a residue, a chronic, low-level suspicion of the world. I became quieter, more observant, more prone to introspection. The easy, unthinking trust of childhood had been irrevocably fractured. I learned to navigate social interactions with a certain guardedness, always a part of me standing back, analyzing, searching for the subtle tells, the cracks in the performance. It was an exhausting way to live, and it isolated me in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. The story of the hollowed man didn't just teach me to fear a specific entity. It taught me to fear the potential for emptiness, for imitation within the familiar. It suggested that the people we knew and loved could be shells, their true selves eroded and replaced by something that only wore their likeness. This concept, far more than any feigned monster or spectral apparition, was what truly haunted me. It was a deeply personal horror, one that attacked the very foundations of identity and relationship. As I grew older, moving into adolescence, the fear became less a conscious preoccupation and more an undercurrent, a permanent filter through which I viewed the world. It manifested as a kind of existential wariness, a difficulty in forming deep connections, a persistent feeling of being an outsider looking in. The world often felt like a stage, and people, actors playing their parts with varying degrees of skill. And always, in the periphery of my awareness, lurked the shadow of the hollowed man, a silent reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that the self could be stolen, that the familiar could be a carefully constructed lie. Grandmother Alara passed away when I was in my late teens. I attended her funeral, stood by her graveside in the old, windswept cemetery, and felt a complex mixture of grief, relief, and a lingering, unshakable dread. With her went her stories, her chilling voice, her knowing eyes. But the story of the hollowed man, her final, most potent gift, remained. It was embedded too deeply, its roots too thoroughly entwined with my own. It had become a part of me, a dark lens shaping my perception, a constant, quiet whisper in the back of my mind, questioning the authenticity of everything and everyone I encountered. The inheritance of fear was complete, and its terms were lifelong. The shadow in the periphery was not just an external observation. It was a reflection of an internal landscape, forever altered by a story told on a still, autumn night. Years unfurled, as they are wont to do, carrying me from adolescence into the ostensibly more rational realm of adulthood. I pursued a career in archival research, a profession that, in retrospect, seems almost a perverse irony. My days were spent sifting through the detritus of other people's lives, piecing together narratives from faded letters, brittle photographs, and forgotten documents. It was a quiet, solitary existence, one that suited the man the hollowed man's story had made of me observant, meticulous, and perpetually at a slight remove from the vibrant, messy business of living. The acute paranoia of my youth had dulled, or so I told myself, transforming into a kind of ingrained cynicism, a habit of looking for the subtext, the discrepancy, the crack in the veneer of everyday life. The hollowed man was no longer a constant specter at my shoulder, but rather a silent, unacknowledged lens through which I viewed the world. It was in this carefully curated solitude that I met Arthur. He was a fellow researcher, assigned to a project adjacent to mine in the hushed halls of the city archive. Arthur was, in many ways, my antithesis. Where I was reserved, he was effusive. Where I was analytical, he was intuitive. He possessed an easy charm, a quick laugh, and a way of speaking about his passions, obscure historical figures, the migration patterns of forgotten tribes, the evolution of cartography that was genuinely infectious. For the first time in many years, I found myself lowering my guard, drawn to his warmth in the uncomplicated way. He seemed to inhabit his own skin. We developed a friendship, then something more. It was a slow, cautious unfolding on my part. But Arthur was patient, his presence a steady, reassuring light in the carefully managed twilight of my existence. For a time, the shadow of the hollowed man seemed to recede entirely. With Arthur, the world felt real, solid. His laughter was genuine. His anger, when it occasionally flared over some bureaucratic inefficiency, was authentic. His memories of his own past, which he shared freely, were detailed and consistent. I allowed myself to believe that the story was finally just that, a story. A dark fable from a childhood, steeped in my grandmother's unsettling narratives. The first tremor occurred on a Tuesday. It was insignificant, a detail so minor that anyone else would have dismissed it instantly. We were discussing a film we had both seen the previous weekend. I mentioned a particular scene, one that had resonated with me. Arthur frowned, a slight, almost imperceptible furrowing of his brow. "I don't recall that part," he said, his voice tinged with a faint note of confusion. I described it again, adding more detail. He shook his head, a small, dismissive gesture. "No, I'm quite sure that wasn't in the version we saw. It was a small thing." Perhaps he had been distracted during that part of the film. Perhaps my memory was faulty. But a cold tendril of unease, horribly familiar, snaked its way into my chest. It was the way he'd said it, the certainty in his tone, coupled with that fleeting look of blankness before his usual amiable expression had clicked back into place. It reminded me, with a sickening lurch, of Grandmother Elara's description of Thomas, the farmer, forgetting small, shared things. I tried to dismiss it. I did dismiss it outwardly. But the seed of doubt once planted began to germinate in the fertile ground of my old fears. I started to watch Arthur more closely. A resurgence of my childhood vigilance that I had thought long dormant. I told myself it was absurd, a product of an overactive imagination, conditioned by years of morbid introspection. Yet I couldn't stop. Other inconsistencies followed, small at first, then more pronounced. He'd forget an anecdote he'd told me only weeks before, then recount it, later as if it were entirely new, sometimes with subtle but significant details altered. He'd misremember the names of places we'd visited together, or the sequence of events on a shared holiday. When I gently pointed these discrepancies out, he would either brush them off with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes, or look at me with a flicker of that same nerving blankness, followed by a carefully constructed expression of mild bewilderment. His physical presence, too, began to feel subtly different. It was nothing I could pinpoint, nothing tangible. But sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, his posture would seem a little too stiff, his movements a fraction too deliberate, as if he were consciously piloting a body that was not entirely his own. His smile, once so open and spontaneous, occasionally seemed to linger a moment too long, becoming a rictus that felt more like a mimicry of warmth than the genuine article. The most disturbing change was in his eyes. Arthur had always had expressive eyes, full of light and intelligence. But increasingly, I would catch moments when they seemed vacant. Not merely unfocused, but empty. Like windows into a room where the lights had been extinguished. It would last only a second or two. However, a fleeting glimpse into an unnerving stillness before the familiar spark returned, leaving me to wonder if I had imagined it. I began to document these instances in a small journal, my handwriting growing increasingly agitated. The act of writing them down felt like a desperate attempt to impose order on a reality that was beginning to fray at the edges. Was Arthur ill? Was he under some immense stress he wasn't sharing? Or was something far more sinister, something straight from the pages of my grandmother's most terrifying tale, unfolding before my very eyes? The memory of Mary, Thomas's wife, haunted me. Her dawning horror, her isolation, the slow, agonizing realization that the man she loved was being erased from within. Was I now Mary? Was Arthur becoming hollowed? The breaking point came during what should have been an ordinary evening. We were at home, a quiet dinner. I was recounting a memory from my childhood, a trivial but specific event involving grandmother Alara and one of her less terrifying stories. Arthur listened, his head tilted, an expression of polite interest on his face. When I finished, he smiled that slightly too wide, slightly too fixed smile that had become increasingly common. "That's a charming story, Alistair," he said, his voice smooth, perfectly modulated. "But you told it to me last month, remember, by the old oak tree in Regent's Park." A cold shock coursed through me. I had never told him that story before. I was certain of it. And we had never been to Regent's Park together. and discussed such things by an oak tree. The details were specific, yet utterly, demonstrably false. "No, Arthur," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I've never told you this before. And we haven't been to Regent's Park in months. And certainly not to discuss my grandmother." He looked at me, and for a horrifying, protracted moment, his face was a complete blank. The smile vanished, the light in his eyes extinguished. There was nothing there. Just a smooth, empty canvas where Arthur should have been. Then, slowly, painstakingly, an expression of gentle concern assembled itself on his features. "Alistair," he said, his voice soft, pitying. "Are you feeling all right? You seem forgetful lately." Grandmother Alara's words echoed in my mind. And the worst part is, sometimes, those closest to the hollowed man, they start to forget what the real person was like. The imitation, however flawed, becomes the new reality. The true person is not just replaced, but erased from memory itself. Is it happening to me? Was I the one whose memory was failing? Was this thing, this hollowed man, not only replacing Arthur, but also rewriting my own past, making me doubt my sanity, my own perceptions? The story was no longer just a story. It was an active, malevolent force, unmaking my world, unmaking me. I don't know what happened to Arthur, or the thing that wore his face. One morning, he was simply gone. No note, no explanation. His belongings were still in place, as if he had merely stepped out for a moment. But he never returned. The authorities found no trace. It was as if he had evaporated. Or perhaps as if the imitation, having served its purpose, or perhaps having become too flawed, had simply been withdrawn. I am alone now, more alone than ever before. The archive, once a place of quiet refuge, now feels like a mausoleum of forgotten selves. I look at the faces of strangers on the street, at my colleagues, even at my own reflection, and the question always burns. Is it you? Or is it the hollowed man, looking back with eyes that are not its own? The story my grandmother told me has consumed my life. Or perhaps it has given my life its only true, terrible meaning. I write this now, not as a warning, for what good are warnings against such an insidious threat? I write this because I must. Because the act of telling, of recording, is the only thing that assures me that I, Alistair Finch, still exist. But even as I write these words, a cold thought takes root. What if this account is not my own? What if the hollowed man is not a creature that replaces others, but a story that replaces its tellers, hollowing them out and filling them with its own narrative, ensuring its own survival through an endless succession of haunted voices? What if I am merely its latest vessel? My memories, my fears, my very identity, nothing more than the latest, meticulously crafted performance. The pen feels heavy in my hand. The words on the page seem to stare back at me, alien and unfamiliar. The reflection in the darkened window, it smiles. But the smile doesn't quite reach its eyes.